I didn't think I'd end up sitting in my childhood bedroom like this. I've been sitting opposite the door, with the bed and dresser drawers blocking it. There's no telling if I can survive tonight. The only other way out is through the window. A set of sheets still on the twin bed, but not enough for a makeshift rope down 3 stories. It's something I'd try as a kid, and learned from getting a broken ankle. Even when the fall was just a single floor, it wasn't one of my better ideas. And what about Hazel? She isn't here with me, but at this point, there's nothing I can do. It's not because I'm a coward. It's because of our separation in the house. Even though our family had a strong history of heart problems, nobody could have prepared for our father's cardiac arrest. Nobody was ready to lose him. The small legion of suited businessmen attending his funeral kept themselves together, never splitting apart. Throughout the service and even at the dinner Hazel and I hosted, they shared the look of a little boy who lost his parents in a massive department store. The group gave a minute-long speech at both. They reminisced about his entrepreneurship and how it was the foundation of their software careers. As they spoke, we were all waiting for them to ask, "Without him, what do we do now?" The question never came, but Hazel and I felt it from the looks on their faces just the same. I didn't have the chance to work with him myself. Software development was never my passion, but the fact that he built a tank strong enough to compete with Adobe alone had my respect. And if he didn't, he wouldn't have been less of a foundation to me. It was his guiding hand that taught me the value of hard work. His wisdom was what taught me to be a man, and even begin business ventures of my own. It was also the lifestyle he constructed for us that proved what enough passion and hard work could do. That luxurious lifestyle showed me the strength a widower could have, and what my sister Sophie would see in a different light. If he could provide for his family, why not me? Why couldn't I do it too? As a teenager, I'd have to hang my head in shame at not understanding code. On the other hand, I discovered my real talent was elsewhere. The minute I was flipping through technical manuals, that's what put me at home. It led to a short time in trade school before completing an apprenticeship, and the proud moment of going into business for myself. Customers were few at first, and I couldn't help thinking it was all for naught. After going out to dinner with one of them several times, though, I first met Hazel. She and I hit it off with shared off-color sense of humor, but it was after sharing a few songs of drunk, off-key karaoke that I started to notice how enchanting her warm smile was. It was only a matter of time until we began dating, moved in together years down the road, and married. Profits hadn't grown a whole lot since. We could just get by with only pennies to save at the end of every month. Once we announced the baby on the way, Dad's business even managed to take a dive. Despite the bit of grim news, we managed to keep our chins up. In a way, he could have been a foundation of my new family too. By then, my older sister Sophie and I were both pushing 30, and after Dad's wallet got thinner, he was harder to take care of. He didn't tell us outright, but we could tell by the tone of his voice over the phone. A new favorite saying of hers was, "What do you mean we don't have that kind of money? We always had that kind of money before." Hazel thought Sophie grew so comfortable with that lifestyle. It was why she never bothered to pursue anything for a career, or even leave the house. I thought it must have been tough doing nothing at all, except collecting those porcelain dolls of hers. Even as a young adult about to go to trade school, I'd see her carry one of them as if it were her child. Whatever doll she paired herself with for the moment always suited her well. It could have been the pale skin or the black smooth hair and short bangs that reflected the overhead light. It may have been the overall thin build. No, it was their eyes. Sophie's eyes were always wide, with large dark irises that blended in with the pupils. We were all sure her natural eye color was a deep brown, but nobody could really say. It was rare that any of us saw her blink. The only times I did were when one of her thick eyelashes loosened itself. Her eyes always had a way of matching those of the dolls she cradled in her arms. But out of the collection that spanned across every wall in her bedroom, there was one she favored the most. Hazel thought it was too late for her to find a man and have a child of her own. I always smiled and agreed, But in the pit of my stomach, it wasn't the case. Of all the porcelain dolls, she held one around the estate the most. It was one whose complexion, hair, and deep black eyes were identical to hers. I even asked Dad if it was custom made to look like her, as if it were a substitute for a flesh and blood playmate. He gave me a perplexed look, an amused but uneasy grin, and shook his head. "No," he told me. "We found that one just as it is." Even now, I found that hard to believe. After sneaking into her room and taking closer looks at it, the story sounded like too much of a coincidence. Not only were the eyes, hair, and complexion the same, but the doll also had the same pattern of grayish freckles on her cheeks. Being stared at by the one doll alone was bad enough. Whenever Sophie carried it around, it had a habit of facing in my direction. Wherever I'd be in the house, no matter which angle it watched from, the eyes had a way of following me about. Just before starting trade school, I asked Sophie, "Why do you always face that doll towards me?" She giggled and gave a blank stare before a little smile twisted on her face. "Don't be silly," she said and giggled. "I don't make Sophie do that. She does as she pleases." As my sister spoke, the doll was facing away from me. It was a moment of peace before I strained my eyes shut and cleared my throat. The second I opened them, Sophie wasn't speaking. She was just standing there, watching, as if waiting for her cue to act. The doll she named after herself had already been slumped over her shoulder like an infant about to be birthed. But now, the little Sophie's head was turned to face up at the ceiling, its frozen eyes glaring down at mine. I didn't even know a porcelain doll's head could pivot like that. She stood there in place, both sets of eyes on me. A moment passed before she walked back to her bedroom. I could even hear her close the door and lock it from the inside. After tiptoeing and pressing my ear against the door, I could hear a string of quiet whispers. Most of it was her, I could say that much. A little bit didn't sound like it though. I've never heard her do voices before. She was never one to try to be funny, but it sounded like it was a smaller voice speaking back to her. The little Sophie alone was enough reason to avoid that bedroom, but there were occasions where it couldn't be done. Stepping in there made me feel surrounded by 100 pairs of dim, lifeless eyes. I wasn't sure if my sister arranged this on purpose, but every time, they were always staring straight at me. The way each doll sat in place, with its hands folded in its lap, was like it'd been waiting for an intruder. Their bodies hadn't been facing me. They were all positioned against the wall and corners to create a perfect shoulder-to-shoulder arrangement. Yet their heads were turned enough for their motionless eyes to peer toward the bedroom door. The doll in the far corner caught my attention more than the others at first. It had to have been the most unique of them all, since Sophie never cradled it in her arms. Despite having all the features and proportions of a small child, it was the size of a full-grown adult. It resembled a red-headed, freckled boy with a red and white striped shirt and denim shorts. Sophie had addressed the rest of her collection by name as she carried them around the house. There was only one she mentioned, in addition to whichever doll was in her care at the moment. She always referred to the other doll as their brother. This had to have been the one Sophie named Big Boy. Big Boy's face stood out from the others, though. Its eyes were larger. They protruded more, casting blacker shadows on their undersides, as if there were big bags hiding underneath. The lips were jutting outward and etched into a sharper, icy scowl. At first, it looked as if its cheeks was decorated with cobwebs. With a closer look, though, I noticed it was a web of tiny cracks. I never found out what, but it looked like a failed blow to the head. The expression on its face made me picture it standing upright and lumbering toward me. Once it stopped, the doll would have been just taller than me. The last time I reluctantly went in there to clean Sophie's laundry, the collection was arranged in the same way, with one exception. At the foot of the empty bed was her little doppelganger, wearing a dark blue dress with a black spiral pattern and matching ebony shoes that reflected the overhead lights. As I was about to turn away, the lights dimmed, but glistened off the doppelganger's eyes. There was a slight, burning glow radiating off its glassy corneas. Carrying the load and turning away from the doll, my body stiffened. The failing lights made it tough to tell, but it looked like the other porcelain creatures turned toward me. Their heads were pivoted just enough for their dead eyes to keep staring. It could have been a trick of the lights, but the look on Big Boy's face was different than before. The grimace on its face had deepened, the eyes holding a black hatred behind the glass and paint. I had to summon my courage just to hurry out and close the door behind me, keeping my eye on it the whole way downstairs. On the way down, there was a gentle banging noise, as if the bedroom door was shuddering from the inside. How Sophie managed to get her doppelganger's outfits to match her own was always a mystery. Throughout the miserable time I lived with her, there was never a package in the mail with her name. Not to mention, she never left the estate to do her own clothes shopping. I never considered myself a social butterfly, but it didn't stop me from leaving the house, even when it came to simple errands. Getting Sophie to get out of that bedroom was worse than pulling teeth. The closer we came to getting outside, the more we heard her warm remarks. "And I think you'll find it interesting that one of the narrower kitchen knives is missing," she once said with a convincing smile. The look on her face as she told me that made my heart stop. My skin grew cold, and I could feel the tiny hairs on my arms stand up. I took a step back, keeping my eyes on her still figure at first, but turned and dashed to the kitchen. Along the way, traces of her shrill giggle echoed down the halls. Digging through the kitchen cutlery, I peered over my shoulder. I never saw unexpected company, but even my own eyes couldn't convince me. The meat cleaver, chef's knife, and bread knife were there. I started to think she was just bluffing to lock herself back in her room. But I realized she wasn't kidding. The long, narrow carver knife was missing. Dad and I had the strongest habit of putting any utensils in its rightful place, and it wasn't misplaced anywhere in the kitchen. A lump was caught in my throat when I tried to speak to her. "Sophie?" No answer. My arm shivered as I started to walk toward the staircase again. "Sophie!" A soft but high-pitched noise emanated from her bedroom. It was the sound of her taunting giggle. I stopped at the foot of the stairs and called, "Sophie!" "You're never going to find it, silly brother. Until I decide. Until it's too late." Taking slow steps back without making a noise, I kept watching the door. Her voice died down. I thought she had enough. "That's right," she croaked at me. "Run with your tail between your legs, little brother. For now, it's a warning." It wasn't any better when one of us tried to get her to take care of the house. The threats always rang from within her bedroom whenever I suggested she take a step toward independence. Until I left for school and then a business and home of my own, the only way for her weight to be pulled is if Dad or I did it. Whenever he wasn't too busy for work and stayed home, it was tolerable. Short fantasies of my hands squeezing her throat tickled me, but I kept my mouth shut around her. She must have noticed the anger in my face at some point, because when it was just me, Sophie brandished her own kind of hell. She never asked me to help her with anything around the house. Sophie demanded it in shrieks, loud enough to tear into my eardrums. I don't know why I gave in and complied. It had to have been a way just to make the noise stop. Of course, I could have said no. That option came to mind every single time Dad asked me for favors with cleaning the 3-story house. But I couldn't bring myself to refuse. Knowing how busy he was getting his business back off the ground again, Dad needed the help. If there were painkillers in my pocket, it was doable enough. Still, I don't know how much longer I could take it. There were countless times where I showed her how to clean as a suggestion, but the response was either nothing or her brandishing matches and lighter fluid. I couldn't tell if she'd do it or not. She never struck a match, but her cold, wide-eyed stare said how tantalizing the idea was. The threats built up enough to send me into a white flash of panic in different parts of the house whenever I'd hear her shrieks. My heart would lock inside my throat. The sheer sound would coat my lungs in thick frost. Throughout my entire life, I've never had trouble with anxiety. Even when it came to going through trade school and taking all the risks and starting a business, I was nervous at times, sure, but it was never anything close to this. Nothing compared to the idea that I'd find a knife sticking out the back of my neck, or my clothes catching fire when I let my guard down. I could only imagine how much worse it was for Dad. He wasn't the one visiting. He kept on living with her until the eventual cardiac arrest. Whether or not she knew about being the heiress to the house, savings, and the other assets was another question. I couldn't help my suspicions when the law firm informed all of us. She was never much of a sister, or a daughter for that matter. The only time Sophie bothered to interact with them was when she demanded for something. The thought that the eldest would inherit everything first wasn't unusual, but she couldn't have known that for sure. Yet the grin that twisted across her face radiated the kind of confidence that said otherwise. That night I asked myself a lot of questions. It was hard to believe why she'd act that way. From the way Dad bounced back in the end, there would have been enough money to stay comfortable for years to come without having to lift a finger. I didn't want to think such a thing of my own sister, but it began to add up. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how she saw our father. No matter how hard someone tries, people can still turn out horrible anyway. While he was the foundation of the person I became, Sophie only looked at him as a piggy bank. If it wasn't for her, he would have still been around. It was Sophie's fault. Yet, she got everything. House, money, the share of the company. And what did my wife and I get? The hollow feeling eating at my gut. Debt. A child on the way with no way to afford another mouth to feed. Paying the bills every month alone was a blessing for us. Throughout the night, I was tossing and turning. I couldn't believe the idea I was considering. At first, it was just a fleeting thought. Then it sprouted and became a real possibility. The more I thought about the outcome, the more it became a real solution. It was all simple too. I'd drive to the estate under the guise of picking her up to get the money, and then I would kill Sophie. It wouldn't be too expensive. Everything I needed was somewhere on the online market. It was just a matter of looking in the right places. There wasn't a good reason not to go through with it. That woman, if I could even call her that, was just a burden of everyone around her. The real reason why Dad and I started cleaning up after her was how she scared off any help who came into the house. I wasn't the only one being threatened. She never bothered with any friends or a job either. Nobody would have noticed her being gone, and it would have made taking care of my family a lot easier. The money was enough to make us comfortable, pay for our child's tuition in full, and then some. There would have been enough to start a new business and fund it for years if our kid wanted to go down that path. After the deed was done, I'd use a few of my connections to get a hold of a wood chipper. There was more than enough space in the basement to get that part of the job done without being seen. The most important part of it would be done with a cement mixer. Once the evidence was coated in cement, it just needed to be broken into little pieces. From there, it would be a matter of selling or getting rid of the gravel. If there wasn't a buyer, I just needed to find a lake or a river and spend the evening skipping stones. Once I did, the only thing left to do would be visiting the house time and again. It wouldn't just serve to maintain the property. Visits also made a great cover. If any neighbors cared enough to butt in, they'd assume I was there to see Sophie. So I wasn't nervous driving back up to the property this morning. On the way, my face felt a strange, cold crawling down like a patient spider, inspecting the fly caught in its web. It didn't occur until arriving at the house that I was smiling. As I pulled up into the driveway, one hand went into my pocket, fondling the small package secured in plastic wrap. It was the ticket to our better life, and one that should have gone undetected. Gripping the tiny package only reminded me of another advantage, how Sophie enjoyed dry wine. I grabbed the new bottle waiting on the back seats and led Hazel to the front door. She had no idea what I was planning. I knew she would have stopped me. Her feelings on Sophie weren't anything more than a simple disliking, but that's because I didn't tell her the whole story. I never told my wife about just how my sister treated people, only that she didn't bother to take care of herself. Hazel already had a look of pure worry anytime I came back from that house, but assumed Sophie would still grow out of it. Hazel saw the undeniable panic etched into my own face. If she'd knew the entire picture, it wouldn't have done her any good. She wasn't the type to holster any true hatred or a grudge, and I didn't want to make this her first. On the way up to the front steps, I gripped her hand. We weren't sure if the pregnancy threw off her walking that much, but I wasn't about to take any risks with our child. I didn't want her coming to the house at all, but Hazel insisted. She gave her a warm smile, assuring that a friend would cheer Sophie up and give her a step in the right direction. I couldn't explain why it was a bad idea without revealing my sister's colorful promises. I just figured if I could keep them apart long enough, it wouldn't have been a problem. After the meat of my plan was through, I tell Hazel that Sophie was too sick to come out. Then we'd drive and get the money on her behalf. When we got inside, I told my wife to sit on one of the couches in the living room. It was better for her to relax in the living room, avoiding any possible strain. Moving upstairs, I could hear my gentle footsteps echo up the corridor. Any other time, Sophie would have immediately known I was inside. But today, she didn't say anything. I couldn't tell if she was asleep, but part of me didn't care to find out. "Sophie," I called in an optimistic voice. "Are you awake? It'll be time to go soon." She hadn't answered, but that didn't matter. There was still a job left to do in the kitchen. I set the wine on the counter and took a corkscrew from one of the drawers beneath. There was a glorious pop of the cork, but no pouring of the glass yet. I dug a hand through my pocket with a cold grin, producing the plastic package. Peeling it open, I removed the little cyanide capsule. I couldn't help examining the thing with a giddy curiosity. It was the first time I've ever seen one in person, and thought how delicious that such a tiny thing could do something with such magnitude. Going through the same drawer, I found the white marble mortar and pestle. It was a strange tool, but proved useful in our cooking endeavors before. But it was even more useful with crushing the capsule into a powder finer than desert sand. It had to be careful and quiet. Any noise could have startled Sophie. Glancing towards the staircase turned my blood cold. After taking one of the numerous wine glasses above the kitchen sink, I scraped the pill dust out of the mortar. Since wine has a certain amount of sediment in it anyway, the cyanide looked easy to hide. Whatever didn't already dissolve, Sophie would swirl around the glass and let fade into the rest of the liquid, then drink it down like the needed dose of medicine it was. I gazed at the staircase again with a tingling chill creeping along my bones. Grabbing the wine glass, I made my way to the third floor, where both of our bedrooms were. The quivering squeak was even louder than on the other stairs. "Sophie," I called again. "I brought a bottle of your favorite. If you come out, I have a glass." At the top of the stairs, I had to restrain myself from laughing. I knocked on the door and saw the knob jiggle in place. My voice was reduced to a mutter. "Sophie, are you awake?" The second before I could knock on the door again, it swung open, as if from a gust of wind. The door banged as it hit against the wall, and I stared into her big, frozen eyes. It'd be the last time I'd have to see that glassy, unblinking menace. Yet a massive wave of reluctancy swept over me. There wasn't remorse, but it still felt like a bad idea. In the end, it was remembering the better life we would have had that set me back on course. She wasn't the one looking up at me, but I still felt myself shrink in her presence. I offered the glass, saying with a pleased tone, "How about we do our business when you finish your glass? We'll be ready. No rush." The door wasn't open wide enough to see much of her collection. My sister's little doppelganger wasn't in sight. She had to have been hiding somewhere in the dimmed overhead light, sitting on the floor of my sister's bed like a ceramic gargoyle. Straight ahead in the dead of gray-orange light were the heavy eyes of Big Boy. His vengeful face was semi-veiled in shadow, eyes reflecting the overhead light like twilight in the night. Big Boy's eyes were stuck on my own, as if he saw what I had done. Sophie looked at the glass, took a gentle smell without moving, fixed her eyes back on me, and took her drink. She touched it to her lips, stepped back, and pushed the door closed in my face. One step back and it was time to play the waiting game. I tilted my head down and stared at the door with a patient, ambitious grin. Whenever the cyanide kicked in, it brought on the very ailment that took our father. The moment confirming it was when a dull thud hit the floor in her room. From there, a chilling silence seeped out into the corridor. I turned away with a deep satisfaction. This was the moment the rest of our lives should have started. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps was louder than ever before. Approaching the staircase, though, I heard the doorknob click. Then a silent, gentle creak. I turned and, seeing Sophie's bedroom door ajar. Straining my eyes, a small window to her limp body lying on the bedroom floor was clear enough. The temptation occurred, but calling out to her wasn't necessary. Parts of the house were old and needed to be replaced. Sophie, having been the so-called caretaker, wasn't a help at all. A doorknob or a lock was bound to fail with enough use. Going down the stairs to the second floor, an explosion of winter cold exploded through the house like a homemade bomb. I wrapped my arms around each other for a grasp at warmth, stopping in my tracks. Seeing my breath right in front of me, I shut my eyes tight. The heating had its shifts in temperature at times, but only by a few degrees. It was never anything like this. A wind of gentle, unintelligible whispers circled around me. The sound was that of a cabal of small murmuring children. It just lasted for a second or two, and a long pause followed. I opened my eyes and looked around for the source, but didn't see anything. A shrill, ear-cutting scream shook throughout the entire house. As I bolted down to the second floor, my path led me into the kitchen by design. On the counters were a dozen of the dolls. Their heads were facing me with a collective grimace. The lips were crackled from within. Their glass eyes were sunken in. The porcelain around them morphed into deep, hollow sockets. The pupils were dilated, consuming nearly the entire irises. Their complexions were pure bone. Little bits of their paint were chipped away, leaving parts of their faces bare. The cheeks were hollow as the eyes, cheekbones protruding enough to look like they'd crack through the exteriors. But in each of their laps, one of the kitchen knives was snug and secure beneath their still hands. How could they have left Sophie's room? It made no sense. I just saw them sitting in her bedroom. Unless the minute I looked away. No, that wasn't possible. It wasn't physically possible. I ran faster through the kitchen and down the stairs to the first floor. That sound. It was Hazel. There wasn't a single doubt in my mind. The instant I stopped at the foot of the stairway, my body froze. My heart was spasming as it rose up into my throat. My wife lay on her stomach, motionless. The handle of the carver knife stuck out of her back. The blade was completely submerged. Fresh blood still seeped through her dress, making its way to the floor. The natural color was still in Hazel's skin, as if she'd stand upright again. Her hair was like someone grabbed her by the back of the scalp and bashed her face against the wooden floor. Sitting on top of her back was Sophie's little doppelganger. She didn't have any of the features of the dolls from the kitchen. This gargoyle just had one I hardly ever saw in my own sister. Her porcelain look-alike had a closed, wide smile etched and curled across her face. Like a fool, I rushed to the door. No matter how hard I tried, there was no moving any of the locks. It was as if they were fused in place. All the while, I kept my eyes on that dark-haired thing. Moving to the windows, I tried pushing them open, but the locks on those were just as impossible. Picking up an old wooden chair next to it, I bashed it against the window itself. I didn't want to crawl through broken glass, but there wasn't another way out down there. Yet despite using all my strength, the glass didn't have a scratch. It didn't stop me at first. I gave the window a few more swings and noticed the chair coming apart. The thing already falling to pieces. I dropped them and saw the glass was left the same. Moving to the steps, I kept my eyes on it until having to go up. Going through the second floor again, the legion of ceramic guardians sitting on the counters were gone. Their knives had disappeared with them. There were no windows or emergency exits on the second floor. It was an idea I brought up to Dad before, but he refused every time. He insisted it was just unnecessary. The only spot was back on the third floor, to block myself off from the rest of the house. After locking my bedroom door on my way in, I performed a search throughout the room. Somehow, I didn't have any company. For safe measure, I dragged both my childhood twin bed and dresser drawers to block off the way in, and just sat there in silence, desperate to keep warm. There was no way the authorities would have believed my story if I reported a thing to them. They would have seen the knife in Hazel's back and made me the prime suspect. I'd have been found guilty and sentenced to the chair. It was a matter of waiting before I heard a sizable container spilling over in Sophie's room. I couldn't say what it was or where it trailed off to. The smell of thick smoke and burning wood and linen began to seep into my room. The doorknob burned in my hand at the touch, and the smell was far stronger at the door. Seeing the black cloud creep inside, I turned to the window. It was already unlocked and slid open with an unusual ease. The door slowly forced its way open, pushing the furniture out of the way. I saw the legion of short-statured shadows out the door. Several of them were holding up the shapes of sharpened blades, the giant among them standing in front, blocking the hall. God forbid I break my neck from trying the window, not knowing if I can make it. My one way out of here is to jump. My normal body temperature is 34 degrees Celsius. Medically, it's considered hypothermia, and I probably should be dead. My parents and even the doctors were confused why I am still alive, breathing and functioning normally. Honestly, I wasn't always like this. My childhood was relatively normal. I was a timid child, preferring the company of dolls instead of playing outside with my older brother and sister. My siblings, Oliver and Leanne, were very rambunctious children. Our parents were used to going to the children's clinic occasionally after their horseplay. Unlike me, the two of them liked their scars. It was like a trophy or something in their minds. But we loved each other, and they tried to include me as much as possible in their games. When they played Dragon, Oliver, and Knight, Leanne, I was the trapped princess at the castle tower, Sophie. I was the queen, the humble peasant, or even just a passerby with no real roles in the game. But I was happy. I was happy to be included and still avoided stitches and bruises. Until the morning of my 6th birthday. I woke up with a terrible pain in my leg. I couldn't stand from the bed and Leanne had to run to our parents' room for help. When Mom pulled down my covers, my right ankle was red and swollen. They took me to the emergency room, thinking I had an extreme allergic reaction to something. But the diagnosis was weirder than they thought. My ankle was broken, and I had bruises on both my legs, as if I had fallen down the stairs. The doctors asked my parents if I did fall, but our house was a one-story bungalow type. There were no stairs or any high places I could have fallen from, and the injury was too recent that it could only have been possible a few hours before we went to the ER. My parents, my siblings, and even I was confused how it was possible. In the end, the doctors concluded that I might have fallen off my bed. They put a cast on me, and I got to stay home for the next couple weeks. It was my first time to get a severe injury, and I did not like the feeling at all. I avoided joining my siblings' games after that, too afraid that I might accidentally get hit. Over the next few weeks, I stayed in my room with my dolls. One afternoon, as I was playing alone, I had a sudden pain in my right stomach. It was like a truck had hit me and I couldn't breathe. Luckily, Oliver ran past our room on his way to get his baseball gear. He saw me lying on the carpet with my mouth wide open, trying to get as much air as possible. He called Mom, who was in the garden, and they rushed me to the hospital. I had a large bruise on my right stomach, and the x-ray showed the bone on my lower rib cage was fractured. I told the doctors I was alone when it happened. No one in my family had ever hit me. I don't think they believed it. Child Protective Services were called to investigate if there was any child abuse at home. Us kids stayed with our aunt while I healed, and our parents dealt with the investigation. I think it was Leanne who planted the first seed of idea in my mind. You know, B, I get hit by a ball on my stomach when you got that pain. Maybe you're feeling the injuries I get. Kind of like a twin thing, but with sisters. I'm really sorry. In our childish minds, it made sense. We were too bonded, and I was too sensitive. The CPS investigation found no evidence of abuse in our home. My parents were good people who loved their children unconditionally. The three of us finally got to go home, and Leanne promised to be more careful if I was indeed channeling her pain in some way. I didn't get any more major injuries after that, but we noticed that I had a lot of random bruises on my body. Sometimes I even wake up with marks on my body like a cigarette burn. Those hurt a lot. Over the next couple of years, my parents sent me to doctors and specialists, trying to figure out if I had some sort of disease causing all those injuries. All my tests were negative. I was in good physical health, but I continued to get marks and bruises on my body. It eventually stopped for a while. And then when I was 10, it happened again. The 5 of us were at the park, flying kites or watching the ducks on the pond. I felt the air rush out of my body and my throat closed in. I felt like I was being strangled by an invisible force. The last I saw was my parents frantically calling for help before I passed out. My memories of that time are kind of blurry now, but I remember seeing a kid in my dream. He was around my age, and he kind of looked like me, except that he was very skinny. He was limping, and he had bruises all over his face. He looked at me with the saddest brown eyes that were eerily similar to mine. When I woke up, I was again at the hospital. It had become like a second home to me. My face and neck were swollen, and my throat was bone dry. I heard the doctors talking to my parents, saying words that didn't make sense to me. Strangulation, trauma on her face and neck, bruises similar to a thick rope around her neck and wrists. I just had an injury similar to a punching bag, and we had no idea why. Once again, CPS was called, but there were a lot of witnesses at the park that day. They all said that I randomly started choking with no external force whatsoever. The bruises also started appearing while I was unconscious, and the paramedics were trying to save me. I felt very afraid. There was an unseen force trying to hurt me, or even kill me. My parents sent me to more doctors. They thought I might have epilepsy or mental disorder, and that I might have been subconsciously hurting myself. I was homeschooled, and my parents took turns watching me sleep at night. When I turned 13, my parents decided to tell me the truth about myself. They thought that it might help me understand all the things that were happening to me. They sat the 3 of us down and told me, "B, we love you. Your brother and sister love you, and we always will, even if we don't share the same blood." I was adopted. My biological mother and I were found living on the streets when I was just a few months old. She was bruised, battered, half crazed, and rambling about leaving my other half behind. The Good Samaritans took us to an asylum where she passed away shortly, and I was given to an orphanage. During a church charity event, my parents went to the orphanage to give out toys and stuff. My father said I grabbed his hand, and he decided he would never let me go. They adopted me on the spot. After that revelation, I realized I might actually have a mental illness of some kind. My biological mother obviously had it, and I had no idea about my biological father. Since then, I stayed indoors a lot. Whenever I wake up to a new bruise on my body, I just thought that I might have done it to myself while I was asleep. I didn't tell my parents any more injuries unless I had to go to the hospital. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and my psychologist thought that I was subconsciously hurting myself during my sleep. Still, I didn't tell anyone about the boy I kept seeing in my dream. As I grew up, he also grew in my mind. We began to look more like each other, but his injuries worsened. I felt a weird connection to that boy in my dream, and I felt sad whenever I woke up. The last major injury I had was when I was 16. I woke up in the middle of the night, choking in my own blood. I could feel my lungs collapsing inside me. With the little air I had, I screamed for Leanne, and she woke up and immediately called 911 as she raced to get our parents. At the ER, I felt pain like I never felt before. I knew I was dying. The cold started at my fingertips, spreading like wildfire all over my body. It was cold and hot at the same time. I couldn't breathe and my vision was tunneling. When the pain reached its limit, I passed out. I dreamed of the boy again, but he was brutally beaten. He was lying on the floor and he kept whispering, "Ryan, Rachel, Ryan." I woke up with fractured and broken rib cages, collapsed left lung, broken collarbone, swollen larynx, and multiple bruises on my arms and legs. I had multiple surgeries and steel pins attached inside me. I had to be on 24/7 observation, and they constantly drained water collecting in my lungs. It was the most agonizing year of my life. Aside from the physical therapy I had to do, I was also subjected to multiple sessions with psychologists and psychiatrists. I was depressed and confused. My parents believed I did all those injuries to myself, and they were as depressed as me. Even after my bones and wounds healed, I had to stay at the hospital for constant observation. My vitals were checked every 5 minutes because my heart rate was too low. My oxygen level was also below normal, and my temperature remained at 34 degrees Celsius. In all medical sense, I should be dead, but I'm not. After a year of daily checkup, the doctors finally gave up in finding the reason for my unusual temperature. I was allowed to go home to continue healing. My parents, my siblings, and I continued seeing a family therapist to deal with the trauma. During one of the private sessions, I mentioned Leanne's comment from so many years ago, how I was too sensitive to the pain of my siblings, and the therapist woke me up with this. Probably, and even though they're not your blood relative, your bond is still too strong. Yes, Leanne and Oliver may be my siblings, but I was adopted. I shouldn't have that kind of intimate connection to them. As Leanne had said, it was a twin thing. When I turned 18, I told my parents that I would go and find my biological family. I wanted to understand where I came from and why those things happened to me. They were worried, of course, so Oliver decided to accompany me. We went to the orphanage, where I got to know my mother's name, Rosalie Evans, and the asylum where she passed away. With a little help from my dad, who was a lawyer, I got Rosalie's medical records from the asylum. She was indeed a little crazy in the end, but the doctors believed it was the result of years of physical and mental abuse. Her body had a lot of bruises and scars from old beatings. I dug a little deeper into her life. She was involved in a lot of domestic abuse reports. It seemed her husband beat her a lot, and their neighbors would repeatedly report him. But at the station, Rosalie would always deny the abuse and gave excuses about her injuries. She was blindly in love with that bastard, and she wouldn't leave him until the day her children were born. As I journeyed on to find my past, I was shocked by another revelation. I was a twin. I found my birth records using Rosalie's name and found out my real name was Rachel Evans, and I had a twin brother, Ryan. At that moment, everything clicked in my mind. The boy in my dreams was my twin. The man I refused to acknowledge as my father was an abusive and disgusting excuse for a human being. My mother was able to run away with me but couldn't bring my brother along. Ryan was left to be raised by that awful man, and he suffered all his life for it. I tried to find Ryan. I told Oliver that I wanted to save him, but I knew in my heart I was too late. And I was. We never found where Ryan was buried, probably somewhere in a pauper's grave. They moved a lot when he was still alive, so it was difficult to trace his life. But we found his medical records. Like our mother, he had many healed fractures and scars from years of abuse. At 16, he died of internal bleeding from a collapsed lung after an altercation with his drunk father, who treated him like a punching bag all throughout his short life. Everything that happened to me was because of Ryan. Leanne was right. It was a twin thing. Every abuse and pain my brother felt, I felt. And when he died, I think a little part of me died too. I'm just glad that when Ryan left this world, he took the bastard with him to the grave. I found his name too, but I don't feel like glorifying his memory in this post. He doesn't deserve that. All I will say is that he was found at a roadside, crazed and mumbling something about his dead kid haunting his dreams. They took him to the same asylum where my mother died, and he was found one morning hanging from the window. Years have passed since then. I have come to accept my weird past and my even weirder present. I was lucky to find a man who was as warm as I am cold, and we are expecting twins in the summer. I think if I get boys, I'll name one of them Ryan, for the boy of my dreams and the brother I never got to know. I always thought suicide was simple. I was taught from an early age that it was wrong, period. It was never the answer. There were always other options, always other ways out. Suicide wasn't an answer. See, my parents are deeply religious. I don't mean that they're cultish or crazed zealots or anything like that, but they hold very seriously to biblical verses. Because of that, they always saw the commandment of thou shalt not kill as applying to suicide as well as murder. They taught me that ultimately they're the same. Suicide is no better than murder, because it is the murder of yourself and an abandonment of hope. They taught me that now, how hard things got, they could never get that bleak. I wish I could have been that naive, but I wasn't. It was 7 years ago to this day when I was told that I have a terminal brain tumor. I was only 19 at the time, still living with my parents, as I worked my way through community college, and anyone could see that things were rough already. My dad had just been fired from his job. We were behind on payments for our house. I could barely scrape up enough money to pay for each semester already, and I knew that this news would break them. We couldn't fight this. Not really. Trying to keep their daughter comfortable as she slowly died would just suck them dry. At that point, I was also broken emotionally. I had just lost my girlfriend of 3 years to a car accident, and my closest friend had moved across the country a few months earlier. My parents and I weren't getting along very well, and when I was told the news, I couldn't have felt more alone in the world. I had thought suicide was simple. Then, I thought it was the answer. It was a week and a half after I found out when I decided to kill myself. My death was inevitable anyways, and this would help them in the long run. The decision made me surprisingly calm, and I knew exactly when and how to do it. My parents both worked on the weekdays, and they left the house empty. All I had to do was circle back after I left for classes, when I knew they were gone, and I'd be good to go. I knew my dad kept a handgun in his study drawer, and it was easy to find and load. I had shot it before. He had taught me how. I remember everything about that moment. It was late morning, and the sun filtered through the blinds of my father's study. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking quietly across the room. I could feel the hard mahogany desk behind me, and could see my hand as I raised it up to my eye level, my wrist trembling a bit as I leveled the gun to my temple, and I took a deep breath. I counted the ticks of the clock. 1, 2, 3. I pulled the trigger. I felt the bullet rip through me. I know that sounds insane, but time seemed to slow to the milliseconds. I could feel the bullet tearing through my skin, ripping a hole in my skull before ultimately shredding through my brain. It didn't hurt. Not like it should have. It was more of a dull awareness that my senses shouldn't have had, and I felt the bullet exit my skull in the same way. Then time sped up again, and my body collapsed in a heap. I couldn't move. I couldn't look anywhere. I just lay there and felt my heart stop. I could see blood trickle out into a sticky pool of red around me, conscious all the while. I couldn't understand it. My mind wouldn't understand it. I had shot myself point blank in the head, and I was somehow bleeding out on the floor and fully conscious. It was impossible. I had thought suicide was simple. Then I thought it might be the answer. As it turned out, it was something much more dangerous and far more horrific. I don't know how long I lay there, but ultimately I was able to pull myself to my feet. I looked around myself in shock at the mess I had made in the study. Blood covered the floor, the desk, my clothes, everything. The wall behind me had stains of red mixed with chunks of brain plastered across it, and I stumbled back in horror. I saw the evidence before me, the proof of my suicide, and yet there I stood, conscious and living. Feeling numb, I subconsciously reached my hand up to my temple, and my fingers felt the hole in my skull. They came away warm and sticky, covered in fresh blood, still oozing from the wound, and I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't make sense of it. The world was spinning around, and my brain couldn't function, couldn't comprehend what was happening to me. I could tell the symptoms of a panic attack were coming on, and I would have normally focused on settling my breathing. Then I realized I wasn't breathing. I couldn't feel my heart, which should have been hammering away in my ribcage. My breaths, which should have been panicked and shallow, weren't there. For all purposes, I should have been dead. I was dead. Was I a ghost? Was this a dream? I didn't know. After the initial shock died away, I was able to focus on my surroundings. Other than the mess of my own gore, everything seemed in place at a glance. But on closer inspection, I realized that there were subtle things that were wrong. The colors of the room were dulled, like when someone turns down the contrast in a photo. The grandfather clock wasn't ticking, and the clock hands remained unmoving. The blood on the wall hadn't moved since I had gotten up, hadn't dripped down the wall any further. Stationary droplets hung to the paint, defying gravity. Nothing in the study made sense, and as I was still examining the room, the light from the window slowly dimmed and faded to darkness. In a few short seconds, I was left standing in complete blackness with time itself standing still. Then, from somewhere downstairs, I heard a screeching howl. It was shrill and painfully loud, ripping through the silence of the study like a jackhammer in the middle of a Sunday mass. I might not have been thinking rationally at the time, but I had enough sense to pick up the gun from the floor beside me as I backed up rapidly. It was ironic when I think about it now. A few short minutes earlier, I had tried to end my own life. Now I was suddenly afraid of losing it, or whatever state of consciousness I had. Seconds later, a deep red glow appeared in the hallway outside of the study. The screeching continued, getting louder as the glow grew brighter, and I instinctively took a few steps back in alarm. It was too dark to see, and my foot slipped on the puddle of my own blood, still on the floor, and my legs went out from under me. I crashed to the floor and the handgun went skidding out of my hands. Then I caught a glimpse of what was making the screeching, what was causing the glow. A figure stepped into the study from the hall, a tall, gangly figure that had to stoop to fit under the doorframe. It was naked and covered in black scales, and the long limbs twisted as it stepped forward. Its eyes shone like red spotlights, piercing the darkness of the room as I scrambled backwards in panic. I wasn't even aware that I was screaming until it spoke. Well, spoke isn't exactly the right word to use. It paused in the doorway, those burning red eyes fixed on me. Behind them I caught a glimpse of a horned head and sharp gleaming teeth, but that mouth didn't move. Yet somehow I heard deep, guttural words echo in my mind. "Why are you screaming, little one?" I instinctively shut my mouth and the creature tilted its head at me. Are you afraid of me? Are you afraid of this place? What? What are you? I stammered as I crawled back. Something that was reminiscent of laughter echoed in my head, although there was no humor in it. It was a twisted, warped sound. Little one, I am the demon of the beyond, the ruler of this realm, of the in-between that exists, between life and death. You've entered into my domain. How? I gasped as my back came up against the hard wall. There was nowhere else to go, no more places to back up to. The demon took another step forward, and this time I felt the ground shake beneath his mighty steps. His eyes never once turned away from me, illuminating my body and the section of the room around me in an eerie light. It's simple. You ended your life on your own, and that gave it to me. I stared, mouth agape. What did that mean? That suicide led to this? That was foolish, ridiculous, impossible. I believed that after death there were only two options, heaven or hell. Suicide, accident, sickness. It didn't matter how you died. How you lived, however, mattered where you ended up. But yet, here I was, dead, yet alive, talking to a demon in my father's study as time stood still. As if reading my thoughts, the demon continued. I do not control eternity itself, but I'm given this little slice of it. When you decided to play God and end your own life, you came to me, not to him, not to the other. You became mine, little one. And now, I give you a choice. What kind of choice? I asked, as I stood up to face the demon. It still towered over me, but I refused to let myself seem powerless. You can either take your chances and pass on through my domain, maybe ending up in one of the two eternities, maybe falling into the void of nothingness, or I can send you back to your mortal world, without the fatal wound you inflicted on yourself, and without the fatal curse that God has bestowed to you. My mouth went dry. You're lying. How can any of this be real? I swear, a different glint came into those horrible eyes as I spoke, and the demon was suddenly at my throat, lifting me into the air by a shockingly powerful arm, and I found myself staring into that gaping maw of teeth. Do you doubt my power, little one? The voice snarled in my mind. I can drain your soul like it's nothing if I so desire. Then, what do you want from me? I managed to gasp out. The mouth closed, then morphed into something like a smile. A successor. I dropped to the floor and hit the ground hard, and the demon moved back a step as it spoke. I tire of being trapped in this realm, a curse given to me by the devil. I hold power, but not enough to release myself, unless I gift that power to another mortal. If you swear your soul to me, I will restore you to your life fully healed, and then when you die, decades later, you will take my place as the gatekeeper of souls in this wretched land. I swallowed hard. And if I refuse? You will wander for several lifetimes here without my guidance, until you either stumble into heaven or hell by chance, or the void claims your soul. The latter is far more likely. The choice is yours. A choice. But there was really no choice left to make. I had tried to kill myself. I had tried to die. And I saw a glimpse of what would happen to my soul if I let go. Suicide wasn't the answer. It was simply the first step to an impossibly painful path. I didn't want that, but to become like this creature. I looked around me then, taking in the study illuminated by the red glow. I saw the pictures of my family on my dad's desk. I saw the Star Wars mug I had given him when I was 10, and the smile it had given him. I saw the trips he and my mom went on with me, when we didn't have much to spend, but had made the most of it. I saw the good times and the bad, and I made another decision right then and there. I decided that I didn't want to lose them. Not for good. You swear to me that you can take away my tumor as well? I asked hesitantly. I swear on the lake of fire itself, the creature said. You will be restored to a full and healthy life, a life that will be untampered with until your demise. Then you will take my place, and I will be released. Then I accept your deal, I said, and I silently prayed that I hadn't made a mistake. In the blink of an eye, the study was back to normal. 1 second it was darkness, with the demon standing before me, and then the next, the morning light was shining through the blinds and the grandfather clock was ticking away angrily across from me. The demon had disappeared, and so had any signs of my attempted, or rather successful, suicide. The blood and fragments of gore had disappeared from the walls and floor, and the gun wasn't anywhere where I had left it. I later found it back in the drawer where I had gotten it. In fact, everything was normal in an instant, and I found myself wondering if what I had just seen was some kind of crazed nightmare. Groaning quietly, I put a hand on the desk beside me to pull myself to my feet, and that was when I saw it. There was a symbol etched into my right wrist, a half-open pentagram that was seemingly carved into the skin. It glowed a faint red like the demon's eyes, but faded away into nothingness after a few moments of looking at it. I know now that what had happened was very much real. The doctors verified, to their amazement, that my tumor had apparently disappeared. I had survived my suicide and was given a second chance at life, a chance that ended up being able to help my family get through their financial struggles and meet the person that would become my wife, a wonderful woman named Amber. But on nights like these, when I'm lying in the dark, alone, I can almost see him standing again in the doorways. My wrist starts to burn, and when I glance down at it, I can once again make out the symbol that's been burned into me. The symbol of the demon of the beyond. The symbol of my fate. And on nights like these, I appreciate the second chance I've been given, but I can't help but wonder at the cost of it that I have yet to face. My son Josh is a great kid. He's always been the quirky and curious type, taking apart watches, toys, and the like, just to see if he can put them back together again. His curiosity, however, took a dark turn when his mother died. Josh became a different kid after that. He suddenly became obsessed with the notion of death and what it means. Thus, it came as no surprise when I found out what he had decided to do for his science fair project. "I'm testing the line between life and death, Dad," he had said matter-of-factly as he sat eating his jam and toast. What do you mean, buddy? Watch this." Josh seized my iPhone, which had been resting on the table, and flung it into the kitchen sink before I could stop him. "Josh!" Josh turned the water on and seized a can opener, whacking the poor phone repeatedly. The screen cracked and the phone itself died. I wanted to yell, but I knew that wasn't the right thing to do. I had to discipline him some other way. "Josh, why would you do that? Do you know how much it's going to cost for me to get that fixed?" "Don't worry, Dad. You won't have to pay for anything." He picked the phone up out of the sink and ran upstairs to his room. I stared after him, shaking my head. I seethed about my son's troubling spontaneous behavior all day at work. When I got home, however, I found my iPhone, screen completely fixed and all. I picked it up, studying it, and found that it was working as if nothing had happened to it at all. "Buddy?" Josh came running down the stairs, goggles over his eyes, and a PlayStation controller in his hand. "Yeah, Dad?" "Who did you get to fix this, and where did you get the money to pay for it?" Josh tilted his head. "What do you mean? I did it myself. That was my first experiment for my project, Dad. I'll move on to phase 2 and document everything tomorrow." I watched, confused, as he ran back up the stairs. I had no idea what he was up to, but I was just happy that I didn't have to pay an arm and a leg to get my phone fixed, or to get a new one. Josh's little experiment seemed harmless. Then came phase 2. I walked into the kitchen the next morning, prepared to make breakfast and coffee, and stopped in my tracks. Josh was standing in front of the counter, a pigeon strapped down to the cutting board in front of him. I immediately had a bad feeling about this. "Josh, buddy, what in the world are you doing?" Josh held up a large pair of scissors. "It's phase 2. Now watch this." I lunged towards the counter, but it was too late. In one swift move, Josh had decapitated the helpless bird. There was a sickening clipping sound, and then the blood was leaking all over the cutting board and my kitchen counter. This time, I lost it. "Josh, what the hell is the matter with you? Why did you do that?" Josh looked frightened by my reaction, as though he hadn't expected me to lose my crap after watching him kill an innocent animal. "Dad, I already told you, it's phase 2. I dropped him off at school and called a psychiatrist. Maybe his mother's death had hit him harder than he was letting on. I have heard stories about serial killers killing live animals when they were children, and I'd be damned if my son turned into a killer. I scheduled an appointment for the next day. When I got home, I found Josh sitting on the couch in the living room, writing in his journal. His poster board for his project was leaning against the wall by the TV. I couldn't help but notice that there was bird crap next to the TV as well. "Josh, what is—" A pigeon swooped past my head and landed on the couch, cooing softly. I jumped at it, hoping to grab it before Josh could, but he made no moves. The pigeon shot back up into the air out of my reach. "Why is there another bird in here? I swear if you—" "It's not another bird, Dad. It's the same one from earlier today." Josh and I stared at each other for a few minutes. I was sizing him up while simultaneously wondering what the hell had suddenly gone wrong. "That can't be, Josh. You cut that bird's head off, remember?" "Yeah, and I put it back on. I brought him back. This project is going really, really well, Dad. I'll beat Cindy Pickens for sure this year." I was entirely positive that Josh had just captured another bird and was losing his mind. But when I checked the garbage can, the bag that I had placed the decapitated bird in was gone. This had gone past the point of too far. Josh had gotten rid of the corpse and was attempting to convince me that he had somehow raised it from the dead. This was meticulous and premeditated. I really did worry about my son, and I am not ashamed to say that I slept with my door locked that night. Well, until about 2 a.m, that is. I was awoken by the last thing you want to hear at 2 a.m. Someone beating non-stop on your front door. Well, beating may be a harsh word. Whoever was knocking was doing it forcefully, but there was not much strength behind the knocks. Still, it scared the hell out of me, but not nearly as much as the sight of Josh standing in the living room, white as a sheet staring at the door. "Josh, why are you out of bed?" Josh turned to me, his eyes wide in terror. "Why? What's the matter, pal? Go back upstairs. I'll figure out who this is." "Don't open the door, Dad. I messed up." The slow knocking continued behind him. "Messed up how?" Josh stared me in the eyes. I wanted to do something really good for phase 3, so I brought Mom back." Knock, 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 knock. "Joshua, your mother has been dead for almost 2 years. This isn't funny." I made a move for the door, but Josh jumped in front of me, grabbing my hand. "Don't open it, Dad. Don't open it." He and I are still sitting in the house. The knocking has stopped, but now there is clawing at the window. I keep asking my son if he can undo his mishap, but he says only one thing. "I'm gonna beat Cindy Pickens for sure this year." No Sleep is closing to the public for a few days. Apparently, that gives me hope. Maybe the reason why is that others have finally caught on to what's really going on here. I'm sorry. I don't know where to start with this, how to introduce myself, how to start a story. I've never been good with any of that. To put it frankly, I've never really been particularly good at anything. You could say I'm a failure at life. I'm a high school senior that has no friends, no girlfriend, and doesn't have a single clue about what he wants to do for graduation. I was never good at sports, or art, or writing, or anything like that. The only thing I really enjoy in my spare time is reading, and that's what first brought me here, to read about the horrific experiences of others. To put it simply, I love scrolling through this subreddit. At first, I never really gave any thought to the posts I read, but in time, I started thinking long and hard about every single one I would read. I started to understand them more than I ever did, and I fully realized what no sleep is. No Sleep is a chronicle of dark events and nightmares. It's full of warnings, written accounts from those of us who have witnessed the unspeakable and desperately want to warn the world before it happens to them as well. I've devoted most of my free time to proving that, to hunting down proof and records of the events we read about. But I never expected that proof to find me first. Throughout most of my high school life, I spent most of my free time hunting down the stories behind the posts of No Sleep. See, we all know about the horrifically real origins of all the experiences we post, but there are so many skeptics on the outside who don't, and I figured that if I could find evidence that definitively proved just a few of the posts on No Sleep are true, people would start taking us seriously. So, I devoted my time to scouring the internet for missing persons cases, for police reports about murders, anything I could tie to one of the stories on here. So far, evidence was few and hard to come by. I found a few bits of pieces here and fragments of news stories and unexplained deaths there, but there wasn't much objective, concrete evidence to go on. I was starting to accept that people on the outside, they would never believe because they didn't want to believe. They didn't want their eyes to be open like ours have been. But everything changed on my first day of Thanksgiving break. It was around 10 in the morning, and I was scrolling through Reddit on my phone. I had just finished checking my gaming subreddits and just switched over to No Sleep. Like most of my subreddits, I tend to sort by new, and the first post I saw when I logged on was one titled, Ben Doesn't Believe, by u/Corey Como. That kind of caught my eye because my name is Ben as well, and the title has so little information, so I clicked on the link. This is what the post said, copied word for word from screenshots I took. Ben doesn't believe. He's living in blissful ignorance as he fools himself and fools others. He likes to pretend that this boring, monotonous existence is all that is there. Ben doesn't want to believe that there's something else, something out there that's more than him. He doesn't want to believe in God. He doesn't want to believe in demons. But believing or not believing doesn't make a difference to the truth. It only means that you're either in acceptance or denial. Ben lives in Cleveland, Ohio, and he's failed in every single way possible. He tries to bury his emptiness by immersing himself in fiction, in books, in games, and shows, but even that's not helping anymore. He doesn't want to believe anything. He doesn't want to believe that every day is another day closer to his inevitable death, unless he changes his mind and starts to believe. Ben won't believe this now. As he reads these paragraphs, he won't believe when it comes for him. He won't believe until it's too late, because that's what Ben does. He wastes his opportunities. Something about that post unnerved me more than anything else I read that day. Maybe because of how short it was, or because of the odd style in which it was written, void of almost any detail. Maybe it was because of how my name was Ben, and that I lived in Cleveland too, and that it was a pretty freaky coincidence. But that was all it was. A weird coincidence. I mean, it couldn't possibly be about me. Who would want to post about me? I'm perfectly normal and perfectly sane. I didn't even think about the whole incident until 2 days later. I was scrolling through Reddit again, this time late at night when I couldn't sleep. I guess that's ironic looking at No Sleep, when I could get no sleep. I had been reading stories for almost half an hour, and at that point, I was skimming through titles looking for anything that caught my eye. That's when I saw it, a post from 3 hours ago titled, Ben Lost His Chance. At first I thought it was a sequel to the other weird one I read a few days back, but this post was written by u/3462937black8. Weird username, but I was curious. I clicked the link. "Why is Ben still awake? It's almost midnight," were the first lines, and I froze. It was almost midnight my time. My name was Ben, and after that last post, was this really somehow about me? I shrugged it off. Coincidence was all it was. Strange, freaky, really improbable coincidence. I kept reading. "Ben is still awake because he missed his chance. He read the truth and he ignored it. He didn't believe, and now there's nothing left for him. He's lying awake in a dark room in his 4-bedroom house, the one at the end of that long, empty street. He's reading this by the dim light of his phone that's only at 17% power, but he doesn't care. He doesn't care about anything anymore. Do you, Ben?" I dropped my phone and rushed over to the light switch, filling my room with blinding yellow light with one flick of the hand. There was no one in my room, despite whatever sudden irrational fear was telling me. I looked out the window, but the street was deserted, just like that post said. I lived in a 2-floor, 4-bedroom house in a neighborhood that's still under construction. As of right now, ours is the only house on that street, so it's mostly empty. And I was lying on my bed, scrolling through my phone, unaware that my battery had dropped down to 17%. Everything that post had said was true for me. Someone, somehow, was watching me and posting about me in a place devoted to the paranormal. What the hell did that mean? I gingerly picked up my phone again, having seen that there was still one paragraph left in the story. At this point, I was pretty sure it was some kind of sick joke. Someone from school, maybe. Or maybe it was my older brother, who was also home on break, playing a prank on me. Maybe even it was some of the online friends I had, the ones that had first told me about no sleep and discussed the stories and their implications long into the nights. Either way, someone was messing with me, and I wasn't very happy about it. I read the last paragraph. "Ben is starting to wonder now if he has this all wrong. How would anyone know things like that? How would they know that the pajamas he's wearing right now are red, or that his favorite drink is iced tea? Or how would some stranger know that he blames himself for Sienna's death? How would they know about that stash that he's hidden underneath that loose floorboard? How would someone on the internet know about his crush on Grace? How would they, Benjamin Kona?" I suddenly switched my phone off and threw it across the room in a burst of anger. This was going too far. Whoever was playing this practical joke using my real name was one step too far, and exposing those things online was just wrong. But with a start, I suddenly realized the gravity of those words. No one from my school knew about my crush on Grace, and no one, not even my family, knew about Sienna. She had been one of my closest friends, someone I had met online, and she had killed herself in my freshman year. For the last 3 years, I held myself responsible for her death because I hadn't been home the day it happened, and she had tried to call me that day. How would someone know about that? Why would someone know about that? Or more importantly, why would someone or something post about me here? I couldn't understand it. What was to gain? What was the point of all of it? And who or what the hell was doing all this to me? I fell asleep that night thinking over and over about that post. When I woke up, the first thing I did was log on to Reddit so I could report the post and message the mods about it. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach when I searched for it and found that the post had been deleted. And not just the post, but the first one from 2 days ago was gone too, as were the accounts Corey Como and 3462937black8. They had all been deleted without a trace, and I was left with nothing. I still sent a message to the mods, but what could I say? That I thought some crazy cyberstalker was posting random things about me on a subreddit meant for paranormal experiences? Sure, I had copied the text of the posts by screenshot the night before, but if the accounts were already gone, they couldn't do anything about it. Needless to say, I didn't much enjoy that Thanksgiving. I felt like my privacy had been violated horribly. The entire next 2 days, I kept looking over my shoulder and out the windows. Even after my brother left to go back to college, I never caught a glimpse of anything unusual. But someone, somehow, had found out things about me. I almost said something to my brother about it, but I knew he'd just laugh at me. He was someone who refused to see the truth about the sides of the world that were hard to believe, and so I kept quiet in my growing fear. Needless to say, I didn't log on to Reddit for a few days. When I logged back on, I wasn't surprised to see that my message to this subreddit's mods hadn't been answered. After the last post, I almost didn't check the feed here. I was scared that I'd find even worse. But a part of me was still being skeptical. After all, the posts and users had been deleted, right? So I took a deep breath and flipped the feed from hot to new. I froze in my chair as the page refreshed, displaying the first 4 post titles, all from different accounts. Ben is a coward. Ben still doesn't believe. It's coming for Ben. And the last one. Ben, you're too late. Don't run. Don't hide. My mouth went dry, and my mind went blank. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. I've never had one before, but I'm pretty sure I was in the middle of a panic attack. I was starting to get the sinking feeling that this wasn't some stalker or person trying to prank me. I had the horrible realization that the evidence I'd been looking for all those years was happening to me in that very moment. When I was finally able to snap myself back into reality, I ran downstairs and checked the doors. All were locked securely, and the garage was closed. But I noticed my dad's car was gone. He probably was working the early shift today. Going back to my room, I felt a little less scared when I saw my mom in the kitchen making breakfast. Someone was trying to get to me, or something was trying to get to me. The posts are never, ever wrong, and if someone was posting things about me, then it had to be true. What that meant terrified me more than anything. I had just gotten back into my room when my phone pinged with a notification. I pulled it up, and in the back of my mind, I knew that this was very, very wrong. I had gotten a notification from Reddit that u/239-81170-RED66 has made a new post to No Sleep. I'd never enabled notifications for Reddit. I never subscribed to any user, let alone one I'd never heard of before. But for some reason, I felt like I couldn't ignore this. I might finally have had my evidence right in front of me. My finger tapped the open button before I even knew what I was doing. No More Warnings was the title. This is what was in the post. Ben thought he could escape by staying offline. He thought he could escape if he didn't read, because he knows that if he reads, he'll believe. And now, it's far too late to believe. He's been running too long and has been too distracted by his meaningless existence. The truth is staring Ben in the face, but he can't see it. Just like he never realized that his father never came from his late shift at work last night at the Kohl's in Westgate Plaza, where he works as a store manager. As I read that last sentence, I felt the panic stir in my stomach and rise up, catching in my throat and stopping my breathing. Had my dad not come back yet? Was that why he wasn't home? I wanted to just dismiss the idea as foolish, as a joke, but I couldn't. I couldn't run from this like I ran from everything else. The information that these posts had contained, the details about me, about Sienna, about where my dad worked. I was starting to realize this post was something far worse than a joke, or even a stalker's posts. I didn't want to read any more of the post, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. If you hadn't been so busy hiding from the truth, Ben, you might have realized soon enough to save him. How does it feel, knowing that you slept soundly, curled up peacefully in that thick red blanket of yours, as your father was ripped to bloody pieces and discarded in a ditch by the side of a road? How does it feel, knowing that you were as blind to the truth of your father's last breaths as you were blind to the truth of the posts you scrolled past? It's too late for you. There will be no more warnings. Do you believe now? Will you believe when you hear the truth when it calls? I felt my hand go numb, and my phone fell out of my fingers as I finished reading the last few words of that post. My mind was running in a million different directions at once, and I felt waves of every emotion from panic to fear to anger to sorrow to disbelief to shock wash over me. I had no time to process the horror that I'd just read, though. Only seconds later, I heard the ringing of our home phone downstairs. Will you believe when you hear the truth when it calls? And just like that, everything clicked into place with a surge of nausea and sheer terror. I scrambled off my bed and leapt down the stairs, trying to reach the phone before my mom picked up. I knew what was coming. I couldn't let her hear it first. I couldn't make her go through that. Hello, Kona household, I heard her say as I was halfway down the stairs, and I knew I was too late. When I sprinted into the kitchen moments later, the look of twisted shock on her face told me everything I needed to know. I felt my legs give way as I sank down to the floor, and I could feel the hot tears pouring down my cheeks as everything caught up to me. This was my fault. This was all my fault. It was a policeman on the phone, calling to let my mom know that they had found a dead man lying in a ditch by Interstate 90, and it was bad. They needed my mom to come down to identify the body, or more accurately, what they could find left of it. She told me all this as she hung up hastily, her voice sounding hollow from the shock, but I just nodded numbly. I knew it was him. My father was dead, just like that post said. It had told me the truth, and I didn't see it. It was a few minutes after my mom left that I remembered a post I read on the sub a week ago, something that I read and commented on, then forgot about. It was an account about a creature that preyed on the weak and the tired, those who worked the night shifts. In the post, the creature would rip its victims to pieces and leave them by the side of the road after eating its fill. I had read that post and went about my day without even thinking that it could actually be true. By now, my dad was dead in the exact same way, and in that moment, it all clicked into place. The horrible, twisted truth of no sleep. No sleep isn't just a place for sharing our experiences, the paranormal and the horrific. It's a damn feeding ground. Everything here, every creature, every death, every account, can be used by them. Have you ever wondered why so many of us escape our brushes with death and things that, by all accounts, should have killed us? It's because they want us to live. They want someone to write about it, to post it out there, so the creatures can feed even more. I don't know if they live off of our fear, or if they literally live off of us. But the creatures of no sleep live, because we immortalize them on the internet forever. Every survivor writes out their transcript and sends it out for the world to see, but they also reveal their account to the mods. Have they ever wondered why this group of shadowy chaperones holds such strict rules and regulations for no sleep? It's because they're the culprits too. They mold the accounts of others into the perfect format to cause fear, and then they go and erase all the evidence that they can find. That's why I could never find a shred of proof. It was all erased on purpose. And somehow, something was trying to warn me about that. Maybe it was one of the mods who got tired of leading the readers to their deaths. I don't know. All I know is that if I listened to their warnings, my father would still be alive. I managed to pull myself up off the floor and shake myself out of my grief and self-pity, at least momentarily. I made my way upstairs to my room and grabbed my car keys, set on driving my car out to meet Mom, when my phone chimed a notification again. I froze and looked down at the face-up screen that was still on the floor. It was another notification from Reddit. Hello, u/23981170RED7 has made a new post to No Sleep. I felt my mouth go dry as I bent down to pick up the phone with shaky hands. I tapped on the notification, but the post title brought the flood of terror washing back over me. It's already in Ben's house. He's too late. I could feel my heartbeat racing as I opened the post quickly, but there was no post to greet me. There was only one word. Hide. I've been up here in my room with the door locked, hiding in the closet for almost 2 hours now. After the first hour, I heard the front door open, followed by my mom calling out for me. I frantically tried to dial her phone to warn her, but before I could, I heard an ear-splitting scream tear through the silence of the house. There were no more sounds, and when I tried her phone, no one picked up. I started typing this right after, desperately trying to get my own warning out in time, before whatever killed my parents finds me too. Maybe I'm just playing into his hands. Maybe it wants me to write about it so that it can grow stronger with every pair of eyes that reads this transcript. But I have to try. I have to try to get this warning out in time. Stay away from no sleep. Everything you read about here can come for you at any time, any place, any day. I don't think every story is used by them to get to us, but the possibility is out there. The creature that killed my family is one of them, and I don't know how many more are out there that the mods are helping. If you think something from the posts here are following you, don't ignore it, and whatever you do, don't ever fall asleep. Stay awake. Stay alert. They're out there. They've always been out there. And they've always known we've been watching them. 7 years ago, I met the girl who could find the seams. You've got to see what Danny can do. I let myself be dragged across the park, past the swings and to the big oak tree, where a girl with long black hair sat with a pile of books beside her. She looked up at the small crowd of fellow children surrounding her, sighed, and set down her book. "Can I help you?" My best friend at the time, Jacob, beamed and plopped a stuffed bear on her lap. "Do the thing. Luca hasn't seen you do it yet," he said. Danny looked at me and my gaze immediately went to my shoes. "You don't have to if you don't want to," I murmured, feeling embarrassed about all the fuss my friend was causing. Jacob scoffed and crossed his arms. "You don't even know what she does yet. Come on, Danny, show him." "I don't mind showing you," she said before picking up the bear. She brushed her fingers against its face, and she smiled before she took her middle finger and ran it from the top of its head to its tummy. Like she'd taken a sharp knife to it, the bear split open, revealing white stuffing and the red heart that had been stuffed in there when Jacob got it. She lifted it up to show it all to us, before plopping it back on her lap and running her finger along the tear. When she pulled her hand away, the bear was whole again, like she'd never ripped it open. Jacob scooped the bear back up and turned to me. "Cool, right?" he asked. I shrugged. "I don't know, I guess," I said, knowing I probably looked less that convinced. Danny smiled then and got to her feet. "Okay, what do you want to see the inside of?" she asked. I glanced around the playground before pointing to the swing set. Can you cut that with your finger?" I asked. I might have only been a kid, but I was definitely not convinced by just cloth. Danny nodded and walked over, the crowd of kids following in her awe. She patted the chain of the pink swing before her finger sliced right through one of the links. The chain came free, and then she proceeded to slice open the plastic of the seat. She picked up the mangled swing, spinning around to show it really wasn't attached at all, before she reattached it, all with the touch of her finger. Now that convinced me. I probably looked like an idiot, just standing there with my jaw dropped while everyone else just clapped. "How do you do that?" I asked in wonder. Danny shuffled her feet, a small smile on her lips. "Everything has a seam I can pop open. I can do it to anything," she admitted. I dug through my pockets and managed to pull out my 3DS. "Can you open this up?" I asked. For the rest of the afternoon, Danny demonstrated her unique and bizarre powers to us. She did open up my 3DS, showing off all the electronics inside, and once she fixed it back up, it booted up just like nothing had happened. She opened up a Rubik's Cube, part of a branch, the monkey bars. Whatever we asked, she would demonstrate. Only if no adults were close, though. One of the other kids suggested she open up one of the cars in the parking lot, and she refused. One by one, we all went home for dinner, until it was just me and Danny. I was pretty awkward at that age, so we just stood in silence for an uncomfortably long time before I finally piped up with the question on my mind. What do you want to open up? She stared at me in surprise for a bit before she shrugged. I don't know. I don't really do it for myself anymore. I just do it so everyone else likes me, she said. I plopped down on the ground and pulled out my 3DS. I don't have to be home for a while longer. My parents are working late. Want to play some games with me? I asked. I don't think anyone really asked Danny to do something with them before that didn't involve her cutting some random object open, but she slowly nodded and sat beside me, and until it got dark we played games. I probably would have stayed out longer if the red light signifying red battery didn't start glaring at us. I'll come back and play with you tomorrow, okay? I said, sticking it in my pocket. Danny was grinning from ear to ear, her smile filled with joy. I'd really like that, Luca, she said. That summer, I spent a lot of time in the park. Of course, it was fun watching Danny cut open whatever object we brought her, but it was more fun just talking with her. She was a really nice girl, after all, just quiet. There were several times I'd be playing my 3DS while she'd watch, and she'd end up falling asleep on my shoulder. She told me most nights she spent wandering around her home rather than sleeping. She never slept well. Then one day, I came to the park while it was raining. I had the stomach ache of a lifetime, but I wanted to see Danny, and she was there, as always. The rain was more of a mist in the air rather than a downpour, but I was more than glad to take a seat under the tree. Danny, of course, immediately picked up that something was off. What's wrong? You don't look so good, she asked, pulling her knees up to her chest. Stomach ache. Mom said there's a flu going around, so don't get too close, I said. Why? Or you'll barf all over me? Danny giggled before something clicked in that head of hers. Luca, you know when you asked me earlier this summer what I'd really want to open the seam of? I nodded. I lied. I kind of want... She blushed a little and murmured the next sentence so quietly I could barely make it out. I kind of want to see if a person has a seam. I responded by wiggling out of my t-shirt. Sure, maybe you can see what's going on with my stomach? I said. I know. What kind of dumbass move is that? But I was a kid, and what kid isn't a little curious about what goes on inside them? Danny clearly didn't expect my enthusiastic consent, but she did a little dance in place before glancing around. No one else is out here, but let's go behind the bushes, just in case, she said. Excitement brimming between the two of us, we hid behind the bushes as I laid down on the ground, staring up at the gray sky. It was peaceful back here. Okay, just start checking, I said. Danny knelt above me, and her cold fingers ran over my chest. I tried not to squirm since I was so ticklish. For several quiet seconds, I just laid there, wondering when she'd start. You can start whenever, I said, thinking she was losing courage. I've already started. I glanced down, and sure enough, she had. I hadn't felt a thing, but my skin over my torso had been opened right up, cut down from the top of my sternum to below my belly button. Skin, muscle, and ribs were just pulled open into the sides so Danny could dig around in my guts. She slid open my stomach and I saw remnants of digested food, the pancakes I'd had for breakfast. She sealed that back up quickly so nothing was disturbed as she proceeded to run her fingers through my intestines. That's so cool, I whispered, afraid if someone caught us now, the little spell she had over me would be broken. I'm not even bleeding. It was true. There was not a single blood drop lost. Nothing seemed desperate to pop out of me either. It was just there. I could see my heart beating, my lungs inflating and deflating with each level breath. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't. I was just fascinated to see what was going on inside of my body. There's something wrong. Danny scowled as she continued to prod, and then I felt a bit of hot pain. Careful, I hissed. Sorry, I don't really know how, but I think something's really wrong in here. Hold still, I'm putting you back together. I stayed still as she finished zipping up my chest. I sat up and poked at my chest as if I expected my seam to burst open and everything to come spilling out all at once. What do you mean something's wrong? Danny shrugged. I don't know. I really don't. I just looked around in there and something doesn't feel right to me. Go talk to your mom. I think she needs to take you to the doctor. Did you really not feel anything when I cut your seam? I shook my head and got to my feet, grimacing as that pain from my gut flared up. Not a thing. You're awesome, Danny. I'm gonna go home now, though, I said. Please hurry. I went home and somehow managed to nag my mom long enough into taking me to the doctor's office about my stomachache. Of course, I'm sure you guessed by now it wasn't just a stomachache. Appendicitis. Luckily, it was all taken out before anything bad happened. But I was bedridden for 2 weeks. When I was finally well enough to play, I couldn't find Danny at the park. Asking around revealed she hadn't been back since that rainy day. She was gone. And she didn't come back into my life until the beginning of this school year. I barely recognized her at first. I'm not really a tall guy, but even compared to your average guy, Danny was practically a tree. She cut her hair short, and she'd grown up, but I saw her face and I knew. Danny. I ran up to her and nearly plowed her over in my eagerness to get to her. Danny nearly jumped out of her skin as she looked down at me. Then she realized who I was. Luca, is that you? She asked. I nodded eagerly, probably looking like an idiot. Yes. Oh my God, Danny, you're tall, I said. When she smiled, I felt like I was a kid in the park all over again. And you're still Luca. I'm so glad. I'm so glad to see you, she said before giving me a quick hug. Do you have lunch next period? We can talk then. Catch up? I barely touched my food because I was just too excited to talk to Danny. She was on the girls' basketball team, was already saving up money for college in a few years. She wanted to be a vet. Meanwhile, all I did was join the school's anime club and still have no idea what I want to do for a living, but she still listened. We didn't talk about seams. It was a silent agreement between us not to. I knew it happened. It wasn't something I made up. But the seams were something from childhood. We didn't need to open them up again. Well, we didn't. Until Danny was hit by a car and left to die by the side of the road. I only heard about it the following morning. One of her team members actually tracked me down to tell me. Apparently, I was the only person outside of the team that was really friends with her. Danny always worked late, and while she was walking home, some drunk joyriders plowed her over. She was found hours later, somehow still alive, and taken to the hospital. Several bones, including both legs and one arm, were broken. Ribs cracked. She was concussed and she lost a lot of blood. She'd be okay in the end, but there was a lot of recovery ahead of her. I nearly cried the first time I visited her in the hospital. Gratefully, she was sleeping at the time, so she didn't hear me sniffling, but I left her a card. It was sitting in her lap when I visited her the next day, and she was awake. But along with her body, her heart had been broken too. I'm never going to play basketball again. Don't say that, I tried to soothe her. Danny snorted. Even if I can walk again, I'll never walk without a limp, and running will be flat out. It's not a big deal. The way she shuddered when she said, not a big deal, gave away quickly that it was, in fact, a big deal. I held her hand and she squeezed her eyes tight as she struggled not to cry. I don't know what to do. They have no idea who hit me. I just know it was a black truck, that's all. They ruined my life, and they're not even going to pay for it, she said. Danny, do you remember the seams? Danny jolted like I'd hit her with a bolt of electricity. What about seams? She asked cautiously. I pulled up my shirt to show off my appendectomy scar. You were right that day about what was wrong. I might be dead by now if you didn't find my seam and look inside. I remember them. But do you? I've never forgotten. Her good hand stroked mine, and I watched as the skin split over the back of my hand. Another touch and it sealed right back up, good as new. It's why I want to be a vet. You know how many animals I can save with my gift? That's amazing, I said, flexing my hand. That day in the park? You didn't come back after that. Danny nodded. I scared myself a bit after I cut you open. And when you didn't come back the next day, I started having nightmares that your chest exploded and all your organs slid out of you. I wouldn't want to go back to the park if you weren't there anyway. Her brow furrowed. Why are you bringing this up now? I can't heal myself. I can only close a seam I opened. I swallowed before leaning in close and lowering my voice. Does opening a seam have to be painless? I asked. It took a second for Danny to get it, but she shook her head. It can hurt as much as I want it to, she said, her gaze turning cold. Then leave the rest to me. You work on getting better, and I promise I'm going to find out who did this to you. It did take months to track them down, but I got help. The girls' basketball team. They want to help Danny, and all I said was I was going to get her justice. They put their feelers out, and we got something. Corey. I never really knew Corey. He ran in a different crowd, but he had a black truck, drunk like a fiend, and rumor had it he bragged to a few close friends that he ran over that goth bitch, aka my friend Danny. My first initial instinct was to just go up and punch him in the face, but I knew that wouldn't work. I'd just get expelled, so I did the next best thing. I knew Corey was a crappy student, and we'd take the same bus to school. I waited until I heard him bitching about struggling with last night's math homework, and then I turned around. Hey man, if you need a bit of help, I can double-check your work, fill in all the right answers if you missed any. He looked baffled, but handed me the paper. I did my best not to cringe at how god-awful his handwriting was, but I corrected his work and handed it back just as we got to school. The next day, Corey slung his arm around my shoulders and said, Pal, buddy, I got 100% on that last assignment. I think this is the start of something beautiful. I smiled back at him. I think it is, I replied. So yes, for the last month I became Corey's personal slave. I finished his homework, and in return, he was somewhat nice to me. He also blabbed a lot, and it was so hard not to just wreck his face when he told me about the night he ran over the goth. But I just thought of Danny in physical therapy, doing her damn best to walk again, and I just smiled and laughed. I got the names of the two other guys in his car, his closest friends, Jay and Thomas. I waited. The waiting was the hardest part, and I'm pretty sure my own grades slid a bit while I was doing both Corey's homework and my own. But it was all worth it for tonight. Because tonight, Corey and his friends were at a party, and I swung by at around midnight to see them stumbling out of the house, laughing their drunk asses off. I rolled down my window and called out their names, offering them a ride. They'd no doubt get pulled over in their condition. And hey, I had some more booze in my car. They could keep the party going in the back seat. Me? I was just the ass-kissing nerd that had been doing Corey's homework for the past month. They never even considered that I drugged the beers I so happily handed them in the back seat. One by one they passed out, and I went on to phase 3 of my plan. I'd planned ahead. I'd let 3 members of the basketball team know that the kind of justice I was looking for wasn't by getting them arrested and having them serve a nothing sentence, while Danny was going to struggle for so much longer with the injuries they gave her. I knew these 3 would go without it. They'd set up the perfect place, a basement in an abandoned building. I was impressed by how much effort they put into it. Plastic was rolled over the floor and part of the walls, and there was a pile of zip ties and 3 chairs set up in the center of the room. The hard part was dragging their unconscious asses down there. By the time I got the last one down there, I was sweating like a pig. But oh, it was all worth it when I brought Danny there and she saw all 3 of them tied up and just starting to stir. She softly gasped as she looked between them. "Are you sure these are the guys?" she asked quietly. I nodded and gestured to them. "Do whatever you want," I said. Danny grinned ear to ear before she walked up to them. Corey was the first to really come to, his eyes fluttering, and he groaned before saying, How much did I drink last night?" "Too much," Danny chirped, pacing back and forth in front of her prey. That woke him right up. Corey's head shot up, and all the blood rushed out of his face as he recognized the girl in front of him, still walking with a crutch to support herself. He, of course, immediately tried to play dumb. "Do I know you? Because I've dated a lot of girls, so I can't really keep track of them." Danny slugged him across the face. "I'm the girl you ran over with your truck," she said, still smiling. Jay and Thomas had woken up from their beauty sleep by this time. Corey spat out a mouthful of blood before looking up and smirking at Danny. "Sorry, don't remember you," he said, smugness oozing out of the creep. Danny circled around the trio of hungover morons, watching how Jay flinched every time he heard the sound of her crutch hitting the ground. "I think he remembers," she hummed before she paused in front of Jay. Jay swallowed before glancing over at the others. No, I don't," he mumbled. Danny cocked her head to the side before she lifted up her hand. She waggled her fingers and then caressed the middle one right up his jawline and over his cheekbone. Jay barely realized that his cheek was hanging from a last inch of connecting flesh before Danny just grabbed it and ripped it right off. Jay screamed at the top of his lungs, blood pouring down his mangled face and down his neck. I could see his teeth and gums. The others looked on in horrific silence as Danny dropped the piece of flesh onto the plastic. "Let's try that again. Do you remember now?" "Yes," Jay wailed, tears sprouting at the corner of his eyes. It wasn't me driving. It was Corey. I thought we just hit a deer or something. But in the morning we heard about you. I wanted to tell someone, I swear, but they wouldn't let me. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Danny hummed and nodded as Jay continued to babble his desperate apologies. "I believe you, so you won't suffer any longer," she said right before she drew her finger right across Jay's neck. So much blood poured down the front of his shirt, a waterfall of blood splattering against the plastic as Jay's head lolled down. He certainly didn't suffer. He was dead in minutes, and all during those minutes, Thomas and Corey were screaming in terror. Any of Corey's smugness had vanished when Danny ripped open his friend's face and cut his throat. Danny turned her murderous stare onto the other two, still smiling from ear to ear. Thomas glanced down at her hand and realized it first. "Oh, where's your knife?" he stammered. All she did was raise her hand into the air and waggle her fingers. "These are my knives. I've always been a bit special." She carefully avoided the blood puddle as she limped over to Thomas. "And even though I'll probably never play basketball or have my full mobility again, you can't take away my gift to find the seam in everything." With just a brush of her fingers, she sliced through Thomas's jersey, and although he begged for his life, she just slowly dragged her hand from his stomach up to his collarbone while he howled in agony. Watching his skin just split by her touch was mesmerizing. The cut so precise, it was like a surgeon's scalpel. Another slice over the gut, and everything just spilled out. There was nothing like letting her find my seam in childhood, where everything just stayed perfectly still. I never knew how really long the intestines were until I watched them plop on the floor, still twitching and alive. Thomas stared in horror at his disemboweled guts until Danny drove her hand into his chest and I heard the loudest squish. Thomas's eyes rolled back and he almost immediately expired. Danny pulled out the remnants of his heart before throwing it on the ground. Corey was crying now, snot dribbling down his lips as he pulled frantically at his zip ties. "Please, it was an accident. It was just an accident, you crazy bitch," he yelled as she trotted in front of him. Danny had been smiling until Corey called her a crazy bitch. The smile dropped, and she sighed, crossing her reddened arms across her chest. "Was it an accident that you drove drunk? Was it an accident that you just drove away? Didn't even attempt to call 911? Was it an accident you've spent all your time until now laughing about running me over?" Maybe I am a crazy bitch. Maybe I am. But if I'm crazy, then you're a downright sociopath. And odds are you'll kill someone else the next time an accident happens. She knelt down to his level and flicked his nose, watching the tip go flying off and sticking to the wall. Corey crossed his eyes to see the damage and promptly pissed himself. I could see the stain in his jeans. "Hey, Corey," Danny giggled, her smile returning and bordering on maniacal. "You ever hear of a torture called death by 1,000 cuts?" I'm just taking a break. Corey and Danny are still in the basement. Last I saw him, though, he barely even looked like a person anymore. She'd removed his nose, lips, ears, and eyelids. He's bald, cuts covering his entire scalp. Dozens of surgical cuts are decorating his arms, legs, torsos, and he's still alive, staring unblinkingly, someplace past begging and tears. But she's not going to let him die just yet. After all, she's been suffering for months because of that accident. He can take a few days before she finally lets him go. I guess I should start with a little backstory. I'm a single father to a beautiful 3.5-year-old boy. I love him with all my heart and soul. His mother left him when he was just a baby and refused to let me see him. I had to go through a lengthy and painful court case, but eventually I was granted joint custody. Then, not too long afterwards, his mother left and it was just us two. I left my job in security to look after him full time. It wasn't easy, as I'm sure any single parent will tell you, but it was extremely rewarding. We don't have any other family, so it's just us, and that's how it's been for the past 2 years. Now to my predicament. We've both had a bit of a stomach bug for the past few days, and have spent all the time just chilling, watching films on the couch. Yesterday morning when I woke up, my son was in much better spirits. He was bouncing around the room and laughing happily and seemed, for the most part, to be completely recovered. Next thing I know, he runs up and jumps on my bed, bouncing and demanding I wake up. I rolled over and pulled the covers over me and let out a huge snore, pretending I was still fast asleep. This only egged him on, though, of course, and before long he was furiously jumping up and down, screaming, "Daddy! Daddy, wake up!" I felt him grab hold of the covers and pull them off of me. I kept my head down and continued to feign sleeping, but instead of the laughter I expected, I suddenly heard him dry heaving before I felt the downpour of sickly, pungent vomit wash over my head and seep down, some crawling its way into my ear canal, before my brain was even able to register what had happened. I stood up and tried my best not to add to the pile of vomit now forming on my bed. I quickly grabbed my son and took him to the bathroom. It wasn't until I tried to start cleaning it that I realized my son was in hysterics. Of course, none of this is all that odd. He obviously just wasn't fully recovered, and all the jumping around caused him to be sick. Nothing unusual. That is, until I tried to calm him. He screamed and recoiled when I moved towards him. I tried to shush him gently and tell him it would all be okay, but the very sight of me seemed to terrify him. I realized it was probably the sight of me covered in vomit that was upsetting him, and so I left him at the toilet and tried to clean myself up at the kitchen sink. The screams of my son in the bathroom were hard to ignore, but I managed, with some panic and urgency, to clean myself up. I went back to my son and held him close as he slowly started to calm down and eventually fall asleep. I left him to sleep on the couch for as long as he needed, while I cleaned the bed and put the clothes away for washing. I left him to sleep on the couch for as long as he needed, while I cleaned the bed and put the clothes away for washing. His reaction when I first tried to comfort him stuck with me, though. Why did he freak out so much at vomit? It's not like he hasn't been sick before. Eventually, I managed to clean everything up, and not long after, heard him stir and awake. He was sitting up peacefully on the couch when I went back in, and I was relieved he seemed to be okay now. It was short-lived, however. As soon as he saw me standing in the door, he started whimpering, and before I could even think, he doubled over and violently puked all over the floor. Of course, the first thing I did was call the doctors and explain what was happening. I should mention, I did check him for a temperature and any rashes earlier while he slept. He seemed to be fine, but we made an appointment at the doctor for later that day anyway. It was very hard to get him to stop crying. Just the sight of me seemed to stress him out greatly, which I'm sure you can imagine didn't feel too great for me. I thought maybe I had upset him somehow. Maybe it's just an extremely bad tantrum coupled with the shock of being so violently sick. Eventually he did calm down and was able to sit next to me, although he was very obviously trying his best to avoid looking at me. I asked him what was wrong, if his tummy hurt or if Daddy did something to scare him. He whimpered, pointed at me and said, "Daddy, your head," before he went pale and started crying again. I touched my head, thinking maybe there was still some sick or something that had seemed to be confirmed when I felt a slick, sticky wetness on the top of my head. I couldn't understand how I'd missed that. I went for a shower while he slept, and it had been a few hours since then, and the vomit would have surely been dried up at this point. I went to check the mirror. When I saw the horror of my reflection, I winced. Actually, I think I stared at it for over an hour trying to make some sense of it. It just had no logical explanation. It defied the laws of physics, biology, nature. It was like looking at an impossible shape. Although it wasn't what I saw that was impossible. It was the fact I was seeing it which made no sense. I gently touched the pulsating gap wound in my head and felt the spongy but firm decaying brain matter within. I've never felt a sensation as strange, my fingers sliding gently across the folds and curves of my brain. It looked almost as surreal as it felt. It was like a beaten, blood-soaked sponge in my head, squeezing out thick red liquid at every touch. I realized I could feel a breeze inside my skull. There was an empty space at the back where some of my brain had been severed and was now dangling carelessly out the back of my skull. I traced the large crack from the top of my skull down toward my nose, where the two halves of my face gradually met again. My left eye was bulging out, and for a moment I considered trying to squeeze it back in. I knew it would be a futile gesture at this point, though. The thing that scared me most wasn't my ghastly appearance, though. It was the realization that came afterwards. My infant son would be alone in this house with my corpse, unable to get food or water. We had no other family, and he wasn't expected at nursery for the next week. I knew I only had one chance to save him. I had to tell someone. I tried using my phone, but I could no longer form words with my mouth. My jaw had slowly started to tighten and lock. I used the last of my strength to lift my phone and started typing. My fingers are getting stiffer and stiffer as I type this. Please, someone go to 49 Kigner Stirs. My son. Please, save my son. No matter how many times I slammed the heel of my foot into this bathroom door, it still stared back at me, defiantly unharmed. I tried the hinge pins. I twisted and prized at them until my fingernails split and my fingertips were blotched with blood blisters. I had no reason to suspect anything was amiss when I woke up that day. Nothing was even slightly out of the ordinary. I poured myself a bowl of cereal and groggily watched raindrops flit downwards across the kitchen window. I always wake up early. 6 a.m. is not an unusual time for me to start the day. 6 a.m. is not an unusual time for me to start my day. My usually loud flatmates were nursing off hangovers from an alcohol-fueled beach party the night prior. so it was more than likely they would skip morning classes and sleep in until noon, which meant I had the morning calm all to myself. Another benefit of being an early riser would, of course, be first dibs on the shower, though in hindsight and all, looking back, I really wish I had chosen to sleep in that morning. It sounds selfish, but perhaps if I had one of my roommates, just might have wound up in this situation instead of me. I was sitting on the floor of the tub, letting the hot water flush over my back, when the pipes in the wall thundered to an immediate stop, with a rumble that chattered my teeth. Then I was left dripping and confused. My first reaction was to think perhaps our water bill hadn't been paid on time. Wouldn't have been the first time either. So I toweled off and checked the sink to confirm. As I suspected, the handles pivoted uselessly, and not even a dribble came from the tap. The water in the toilet had submerged well below the usual orange bacteria ring the water leveled at normally, but the tank was completely full. A tender mercy that ended up being my only source of water in the end. Then, as you are aware, I tried the door. It refused to budge. The handle refused to unlock or give. I even uselessly tried to unscrew the screws on either side of the handle, with every item I could find in the drawers. After all other methods failed, I crawled down, hands and knees, and angled my eye so it was flush with the gap beneath the door. It was frighteningly black. The most sincere, starless, godless black you could imagine. The strangest part, though, was when I tried to stuff my fingers into said gap, they stopped, just as though I was trying to push my fingers through a wall. It was like a strip of solidified shadow had been wedged beneath the door. My 4 roommates are very inconsiderately loud, as I mentioned before, so I waited on the floor and watched the hours crawl painfully and sluggishly by, waiting for one of them to wake up. But the relief, the noise, never came. I used to resent how discourteous they were, but I begged for it then on the bathroom floor. After I stopped calling out, it became quickly apparent how any and all noise had been siphoned from the room. It was unusual not to hear any of the usual noise my roommates produced. It was another level of unusual entirely, to hear no ambient noise coming from my surroundings. In a room ebbing with an ever-growing sense of disquietude, my thoughts turned to something I had learned about before: anechoic chambers. The walls are made of incredulously thick Arrington brick and concrete. The doors are meticulously sealed to prevent upwards of 99% of any exterior noise from breaching the room. To emphasize, this acoustic dampening forces you to start measuring sound in negative decibels. This, in turn, molds the sounds of your body into the ambient noise you're usually used to hearing. You begin to experience your heartbeat, your lungs wetly expand behind your ribs. You can hear your stomach gurgle, your joints pop when you move. It's a maddening experience. Supposedly, no one had ever lasted more than 45 minutes. I guess I shattered that record. The lack of acoustic reflection also takes away your ability to self-balance, since your body is reliant on audible cues your feet make when stepping. This meant I'd often stick to moving on my hands and knees to avoid collapsing and hurting myself. I have 4 bulb lights above the mirror on top of my sink. They would periodically crackle to light, for minutes, sometimes hours at a time. There were no shadows in the bathroom, so once they flicker off, I'd be left in the most sincere darkness imaginable. It's also the only time I'd be granted relief from the crap show orchestral my body produced in there. I could, strangely enough, hear the electrical currents running up the contacts at the base of the bulbs and into the filaments. It was always a welcome distraction. My phone battery had been nearly full when I entered the bathroom that morning, but over the course of my time in that room, no matter how much I moderated my own use of it, the battery dwindled at 1% for the last few days. My only source of connection to the outside world hung on by a thread, and yes, I tried lifting my smartphone to every single ceiling corner, every single angle I could imagine those first few days. But my phone never left offline mode, and every time I'd try to connect, I'd get the same message: cellular update failed. I was limited in what I could do without data or a Wi-Fi connection. I didn't have any games either, so I turned it into a makeshift watch and journal, added passages to my notes daily. Then I'd check the time and date. Then I'd force myself to shut it off. I made a routine out of it. It was the only sense of normalcy I maintained in there. Over the course of the next few weeks in there, my breath had turned a pungent and sickly flavor of sweetly sour, like peaches, rotting in the sun. I later learned that meant my body had left ketosis and started to eat away at the proteins in my muscle tissue for fuel. I scrounged under the cabinets for anything to stop my mounting stomach pains. I chewed on and swallowed cotton balls. I would lay in the tub and eat away at rolls of toilet paper. The only thing I ever scrounged up of any real nutritional value was a glue trap on the floor of the empty bathroom closet. It held only a curled millipede and a few wispy spider carcasses. To me, these morsels tasted heavenly. I laid my bathroom rugs and towels into the tub to allow myself some sort of comfort. I'd sit there in the dark spells with the shower curtain drawn meaninglessly. The only tool I had to stave off the hallucinations was my thoughts. I concluded that my bathroom and I were somehow stitched instantaneously into an underlying reality that day. It doesn't make much sense, I know, but it's the only explanation I can drum up for being torn so suddenly into what appears to be an intangible shadow place, protected only by the collapsing walls of my own previous reality and my dwindling sanity. After precisely 4 weeks and 2 days of monotonous, insanity-laced boredom, something knocked on the other side of the door. I first assumed it was another of the hallucinations that came and went like the ocean tide on a daily basis, and waited, curled fetal in my tub for it to stop. But the knocking only persevered. The more I attempted to ignore the tapping at my door, the more intensely that knocking became. It was accompanied by a faint fluttering noise, as if you could hear the damp snowflakes drifting in careless persuasion around you in a snowstorm. Or perhaps it was more comparable to the flap of a moth's wings, only magnified in the thousands with the noise turned up to a perceivable percussion. The knocking raised to a crescendo, then escalated to fists pounding on the other side. I felt the door rattle and shiver through the porcelain tub. The door I had so desperately wanted to break down before was splintering and fracturing beneath some unknown and likely incomprehensible force. Ironically, I now wanted nothing more than for that door to remain upright and firmly in place. Then I heard one final, deafening shock, followed by shards of wood clanking across the naked tile of the bathroom. Then I heard the inside lock I could not undo. The lock I had tried so desperately to release click unlocked with mocking ease. The knob turned. I heard the door swing open and tap the wall with a shudder of finality. The lights began to flicker and hum. I felt something linger in the doorway, and so that's when I looked up from the porcelain lip of the bathtub. Behind it was the black of space, uninterrupted by any forms or any patterns. It stood there watching me. It was a writhing mass of white static, a crude human imitation. Its limbs were wrong. They were exaggerated and long, its fingers crude, its form still, and yet unstill. I could see the writhing mass of it swimming like a blizzard inside the limitations of its outline. Its eyes were no more than 2 narrow slits that projected out the shadow world behind it, in unstable, inky interruptions. Its mouth was the same, small and lipless. It stared with a toothless grin for some time. I couldn't take my eyes away from it. It drew my attention almost unconsciously. It swallowed my thoughts. It stole away any resistance I could muster effortlessly. As it stepped into the room, the bulbs began to heat up. The filaments dilated up to blinding pulses as chaotic as the thing itself. Its form didn't seem to set properly in the bathroom. Its writhing, television-static body seemed almost comically layered over the tile and backdrop. The grimacing slots of void of its face remained. Its eyes furrowed, almost in anger, as it drifted closer. I could no longer hear my heart flutter over the deafening hum this creature emitted, but I could still feel it pumping itself into tachycardia. My breath was stifling. My head was aching and spacey. I began to see dots in my periphery. The maelstrom of noise was enough. I thought it would burst my eardrums. I lifted my arms defensively. It kneeled next to the tub. It leaned in close and wrapped its buzzing, sickle fingers around my wrist. Its fingertips barbed into my flesh, and electricity burned down my arm. It leaned that wry mouth in close and suckled the flesh of my wrist. After a moment of blinding horror, it pulled its head away, leaving behind a swirling, nebulous circle. It leaned in ever closer and spoke to me. Its voice was absolute, a message that came from nowhere, but also everywhere. A message drooled tiredly from its mouth. Its vacant eyes never faltered from my own. As it spoke, the light bulbs above the sink began to overheat and explode. They popped one by one, like the shattering nerves in my wrist. "Intruder," it hissed. The room was dark again, except for the humming thing that was peering past the layers of my soul. It spoke again, its voice not one, but many, a locust swarm of sounds twisted into sentences. "There are some sights that your simple God never intended for human eyes to see. This appears to be an oversight by him, so I will release you. But before I do, I must tell you some things leave stains on your flesh, others your soul. This will leave a stain on your mind most of all, a stain you will never be able to wash away, no matter how hard you scrub. This will haunt your feeble mind until your body fails you." Perhaps it was the overstimulation, the dangerous magnitudes my heartbeat had exceeded, but I lost consciousness then. When I woke up, it was in a bright and warm hospital room. The world seeped in through the slitted windows beyond. I felt the light kiss my skin. I was wrapped in the warm arms of a scratchy hospital blanket. Officially, no one can explain what happened to me. To the outside world, I was locked in my bathroom for no more than 6 hours when I was found. But I was dangerously emaciated, anemic, and my body had been depleted of nearly all its vital electrolytes. I was beginning to think it was all a horrible fever dream. That is, until my eyes drifted down to my wrist, and I saw the inky black circle sitting beneath the skin. And I remembered what the thing had told me, and that's when I screamed. Once had a fella tried to tell me that, in all the history of the whole world, no one had ever truly deserved to die. Now I heard him out, and I will say that, well, his argument was better than most. He said when you put someone away forever, you're letting time decide that they're not right for this world. Because no matter how evil they may seem, no matter what they did, you can't know if they just needed more time to reflect and to learn and to find God, what have you. He said that when you lock someone up for 300 or 400 years, which I've seen, you're saying that if they lived that long, they'd get another shot. They just don't live that long, is all. But when you sentence a fella to death, that's making a bold claim. That's saying, no matter how long they have, hell, even if they live till the bars rust off, they were never going to change. And that wasn't right to say about nobody. Now that's a damn fine argument, and I would have agreed with him, I think, if I hadn't gone toe-to-toe with the forever killer. You may not know his name, on the count of he had so many of them, but you'll know the cases, even if you didn't know to string them together. About 30 years back, I was new on the force, and there was a real doozy of one. 2 young girls, high school age, hung up on meat hooks down south. Remember that? It was a dirty job, and they'd been up there for months. But it seemed the fella wasn't too careful, because he left just about every identifiable piece of DNA you could think of back there. So, we found him, and you'd think that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Maybe this next part'll jog your memory. Guy had banged up his head a couple months back on a job site, about 2 weeks after he'd hooked them girls up. Had no memory of it. Of anything, mind you. In fact, he'd just gotten out of some trauma unit for the injury. Turns out he had complete, and this is rare, rarer than it is in the movies, he had complete retrograde amnesia. If I'm copying that right. He was fine for the most part. Turns out he'd just hit his head exactly in the one spot that would do it. Now you're going to call a sham, and we did, But I'll tell you, I'm a man of science myself, even when I don't understand it. And these gizmos we got now, can't doubt them. We ran all kinds of tests on him, took all kinds of pictures of his brain, checked his pupils when we showed him the pictures. Every new piece of lie-proof machinery we had at the time we threw at him. And there you had it. He was telling the truth. Oh, it was a case all right. And it blew up. Not everywhere, but most places. And in the end, after he'd broken down in the courtroom apologizing, saying he couldn't believe that man he was had ever done such a thing, they had to let him go. Killer was dead, the judge ruled, killed by fiberglass, and this fella here was just taking his body for a spin. Oh, the look on those girls' mothers' faces, I tell you. I ain't ever seen anything like it since. Whatever our thoughts on the matter, though, it's one of those things so bizarre you had to accept it. Strange things happen all the time. Not twice, though. Not the same strange thing. Not to the same fella. That's when it heated up. 'Cause about 2 years later, there was that boy they found in the warehouse. The one who'd been chopped to hell. And I won't go any further than that. And as it turns out, you can change your brain, but not your blood. And once again, he left us plenty of evidence. And we found him. Again. And what do you know? He knew nothing of it. Again. This time it was a car accident a few weeks prior. Totally wiped it all. Like when a computer falls in the tub. Same damn part of the brain exactly. He's a new man now, all that. Same tests show the same thing. Had different people run them. Didn't matter. He'd left the hospital days prior and had just been trying to start a new life, he reckoned. Knew nothing about some little boy and certainly nothing about who he'd been before. Oh, that gave him a right scare. So yeah, he went to court. And yeah, you guessed it. It was a fast trial. They had already set the standard, hadn't they? On the same fella. 'Cause if they let the first guy off on the count of his amnesia, then they had to let the second guy off too, even when the first amnesia guy did it. Didn't they? Wasn't the whole point that they weren't the same person? Granted, this obviously opened up a whole can of worms on evil blood and the like, and beneath it all, that's still there to unpack. The idea that this fella, no matter how many times he bumped his head and started off and started working as a plumber or an executive or a financial risk advisor or whatever the hell those people do, maybe he was just always going to be a killer. That was a fair question, and there seemed to be something to it, because wouldn't you know, it happened not once, but 2 more times in the next 10 years. I was a rookie the first time I booked him, and I was taking the sergeant's test the next time we had any real breakthroughs on it. Oh, and it was a game changer. Now, obviously, after time number 2, he had a little more restrictions on him, and granted, he fought them every time, and always won on the count of we was harassing him when he didn't know why. But my squad, we checked in every once in a while, best we could, given the distance we needed to keep, and eventually, after murder and head knock number 5, we found it. Found his, I don't know what you'd call it, his manifesto? I'll tell you. I didn't understand a lot of it, but what I did understand was some of the most demented stuff I had ever read. It was like all the highbrow Ivy League misery in the world had crammed itself into 200 pages in press print. It gave details on all of it, even the first crime, which we think now was 2 retrograde amnesias before them girls. He'd been some student brain surgeon, we think. Go figure. And he had chapters and chapters on philosophy and change and karma and evil and chaos and apex predators and God, and a section on the Egyptian pharaohs, and I think a few pages on the invention of the battery. And if you can get through it yourself, you've damn sure got a better attention span than me. But the last section, the last 20 pages or so, it was instructions. Instructions on how to kill, how to bump his head, and, of course, how to print the book and hide it somewhere where he was sure the next fellow would find it. There you have it. Son of a bitch was brainwashing himself. Hell, from what we could decipher of that manual of his, he'd even wanted us to catch him each time. And we just hadn't always done our jobs right. But the instructions even said to leave the mess. We were trapped in his cycle. Kill, hide the book, bump the head, wake up a new man, for real. Stumble upon the book, kill, rinse, repeat. And we knew it wasn't just one book. He was printing a couple and hiding them all over. That was the thing. He knew himself. Even his next self must have known what his favorite foods would be or whatever, knew where to hide it, knew exactly how to write it, to make the first page dig its hooks in. And even with all that, you'd think we could lock him up. But you know what? Don't work that way. A man is innocent until he's not. And you know what? I agree with that. I do. So even though we knew he'd hidden these books everywhere and was just lying in wait, we let him off the leash like we always had. Same song and dance. Let him run off and be the new man with the new life, all according to the old man's plan. He had us on the ropes, I'll admit, but this deputy chief of police here don't let that kind of business slide. That's not me. So I got some trustworthy boys from the old squad together, and we waited and we watched. Oh, and we watched a long time. And we knew we weren't going to ever know him better than he knew himself, but we learned about the next best thing. We learned about the new him, the most recent one. Saw him hit the same coffee shop every morning. Lovely place, nice big windows. And one night, we went into the evidence locker and found one of his books of bedtime stories, and we put it there at his favorite table. And sure enough, he found it that very next morning. We waited and watched. No foul play. Saw him open the book, saw him flip a few pages, and right when he slipped it into his bag, my number one guy popped him from 2 blocks away. Never even got to finish his latte. Now the trigger man is doing 300 or 400 in some cell in the big city, but he's a right hero to us. We make sure he's taken care of. And I know that somewhere in that book, written backwards or in the margins or in some made-up language, there's a bit about how it was all his master plan to have an innocent man die, and us becoming one of him, and the ultimate goal being to make us all killers, and show that there ain't no difference and all that. And that's fine by me. Nobody there to read it now. Can't let evil win. Not ever, not even when it plays by the rules. And that's what I told that fella that argued with me that one night. I told him that it takes a lot for me to put you down forever. But when I do, forever ain't long enough. When my boyfriend first moved into our apartment, everything seemed okay. I moved in after he had been there a month or two, and we started our life together in our little home. We made dinner together, played video games together, and slept curled up each night. But our favorite thing to do together? Watch supernatural documentaries and movies. Our main addiction was Ghost Adventures. We'd watch it for hours on end, and he would often end up falling asleep in the middle of an episode. I would turn the TV off at this point and try to get some rest. After about a month of this being our routine, we started noticing strange things happening in the apartment. My boyfriend would wake up in the middle of the night to tell me I was talking in my sleep. Not just normal, mumbling sleep talking, but ominous sentences that scared him enough to turn the lights on. One of the scarier things I remember him telling me I said was, "It's outside. I can hear it. It's tapping on the window. Don't let it in." He also said I frequently spoke in what he described as sounding like a demonic language. This took place for a long time, and while it freaked us both out, we never experienced anything that made us think there was any truth to what I was saying, until one night, a few months later. My boyfriend worked second shift at a warehouse, and I went to school full-time during the day, so we didn't get to see much of each other until the weekend. Most nights I would try to stay up until 12:30 a.m. when he got home, just to spend a few minutes with him. But sometimes, I just couldn't keep my eyes open. When I would fall asleep, my boyfriend would come home and kiss me on the forehead, as a way of saying, "I'm home now." I loved this gesture. I had taken several exams one day in November and was mentally drained. I strained to stay awake, but I remember looking at the red 11 o'clock on my alarm clock while my eyes fell shut. I was in what I call a half sleep, where you're aware that you're sleeping, but you can hear what's going on around you. I was like this for quite some time, until I heard the little click of our door unlocking. Then I heard the door open and shut, followed by footsteps through our living room and into the bedroom. I felt the light kiss on my forehead and opened my eyes to welcome my boyfriend home. The usual sequence of events. But when I opened my eyes, I was greeted with an empty room. I thought maybe my boyfriend had kissed me and then gone to the bathroom. But those bright red numbers only read 11:39. I don't know what was in my room that night, and I have trouble believing it was only a dream. Now when I get forehead kisses at night, I don't open my eyes. As far back as I can remember, my father insisted that I had a special destiny. I was to follow in his footsteps and become a Walmart greeter. I remember one Friday evening, back when I was in kindergarten, when my father came home from a staff meeting. I ran up to him and asked, "How was work, Daddy?" His eyes lit up and he said, "I had the most amazing day at the most amazing job on the planet." Holding his blue Walmart vest in the crook of his arm, he gave me one of those effortless, one-armed wraparound hugs that made me feel both warm and loved. In my mind, being a Walmart greeter was situated somewhere between F-14 fighter pilot and Ninja Turtle. It was a career steeped in mystery that promised untold adventure. My father never attempted to dispel this illusion, never said the job was demeaning, and never suggested that maybe better occupations existed. I had no reason to doubt him. I adored him with all my heart. The notion that my father would lie to me was an alien thought outside of the realm of possibility. A couple years later in grade 2, our teacher sent home a newsletter inviting parents to come visit our classroom and tell us all about their careers. We heard from a nurse, a mechanic, and a plumber. After work one evening, I asked my dad if he wanted to speak to my class and tell them all about his career as a Walmart greeter. "Oh no," he said, shaking his head. "It is an immense responsibility that few can handle. Besides, if everyone had their dreams come true, it would no longer be special, right?" I was disappointed, but I understood. "Cheer up, my little raptor," he said, revealing a bag of assorted plastic dinosaurs. "Look what I picked up from work." Elated, I jumped up and poured the contents onto the kitchen table. I selected a jet black T-Rex and passed it to my father. "This is for you." "Thanks," he said. His broad smile was almost too large for his face. "I'll cherish this always." In grade 3, a new kid moved in down the street, a hellion named Colin. As soon as we met, he took a special interest in making my life a living hell. I remember it was recess, and I was sitting alone, eating a fruit roll-up in the cafeteria. Colin sat across from me and said, "Hey, I saw your dad working down at Walmart." My eyes lit up. I was so proud of my father. "Cool," I said. "Isn't he awesome? That's what I'm going to do when I grow up." Colin threw his head back, laughing. "You dumbass. You're going to work at Walmart too? I guess retard runs in the family." He said it loud enough for the other kids to hear, and a couple of goons sidled up alongside Colin, smelling blood. I was mortified. This was the first time I had ever heard anyone criticize my dad's job. I had never questioned it before. Why would I? My father always assured me that he had the best job in the world. The bell rang before I could muster a reply. As I walked away, I heard Colin say, "Can you believe that retard wants to work at Walmart?" After school, I sauntered home and cried in my room. My dad knocked softly on the door and asked, "What's up, kiddo?" I dried my eyes and tried to explain between sobs. "The kids at school teased me because you are a Walmart greeter." He sat down on the bed beside me and gently rubbed my back. "They make fun of what they don't understand. They cannot comprehend how special my job is, how it has the power to make all our dreams come true. Trust me." I choked on spit and sputtered, "Okay, I'll trust you." I gave him a big hug and said, "I love you, Dad." He squeezed back and said, "I love you too, son." Afterwards, we watched Jurassic Park and pretended we were dinosaurs. I was a velociraptor and he was the mighty T-Rex. The encounter with Colin at recess was a preview for the downhill slide my life would take. From that point forward, non-stop, inescapable bullying soon came to define my existence. Colin had an amazing talent for harassment. He skillfully turned my classmates against me, even kids I thought were friends. He came up with the hateful nickname Wally Walmart. Every time someone said that name, it felt like a mason jar of acid was tossed onto my face. I couldn't go out for lunch or walk the hallways without hearing that hateful moniker. I endured years of insults and harassment. Eventually, the constant degradation ate away at my self-esteem, and soon I began to seriously question my father's plan. I was in grade 5 when I finally built up the nerve to confront my father. "Hey, Dad," I said, "what if I don't want to become a Walmart greeter?" Initially, he looked shocked, but then he sighed and his features relaxed. He sat down beside me and said, "I knew this question would come up one day. I can't say I haven't been dreading it. Never lose sight of our goal. You have to trust me on this. It will all make sense one day." "But what if I want to do something else, like become a doctor or a fireman?" I said. He shook his head. "No, you must push those thoughts out of your head. You must stay focused and stick to the plan. You have a great responsibility. When you turn 18, you are going to become a Walmart greeter and work alongside me, and that is final." "But," I said, "no buts. Trust me." He never lost his temper, but I could tell I had hit a nerve. I let it drop then, but the thought continued to linger and fester in my mind. In grade 6, my dad started seeing this nice lady named Lois. She always came by on Friday nights, just before the weekly staff meetings. Without fail, she greeted me with a bag of assorted candies. She guessed correctly that sugar was a golden ticket to secure my approval. Then one day she stopped coming by. I recall my dad was really upset. This was extraordinarily out of character. He was always in high spirits, even after a long day at work. I finally understood my father's mood when we went to Lois's funeral. I asked what happened and was told that she had a stroke. I remember I was filling a plate with sweets at her memorial service when I heard from an adjoining room my dad arguing with a bearded man. "Murray, you got to understand, the rock needs to be fed. We had no choice." I'd seen him before. He was one of my father's co-workers. "I know," my father replied. "I just wish it didn't have to be her." "Who else then? You? Your son?" The man placed his hand on my father's shoulder, but he brushed it aside and stormed off. It was one of the few times I've ever seen my father upset. I wanted to follow him, tell him everything was going to be okay, and comfort him like he always comforted me. I had so many questions. I wanted to know what my father and the bearded man were arguing about. I wanted to know why Lois's casket was closed when she had a stroke. And I wanted to know why everything smelled so strongly of ozone. I never asked any of these questions, figuring it was not a good time. Instead, I went back to my plate of sweets. As I grew into adolescence, I took to routinely defying my father's wishes. The constant refrain of "trust me" was growing thinner, and the elaborate fantasy he had spent my life building was crumbling. Soon I came to absolutely loathe the idea of becoming a Walmart greeter. Every time I thought about it, my mind was thrust into the nightmare gauntlet of jeers and insults hurled at me by my peers. And since my father was responsible for this, by extension, I began to hate him as well. If not for him, I would not be Wally Walmart. "There is no way I'm going to become a Walmart greeter," I shouted at my 13th birthday. Since I was a social pariah, it was just the two of us. "Please, you're still young," he said. "You'll understand when you're older. Trust me." "No," I shouted. "I know I can do better than that. Why won't you tell me what is so special about that stupid job?" He paused for a moment. It almost looked like he was going to explain everything, and finally reveal the arcane truths of his so-called wonderful job. "Look," he said, "I cannot tell you much, you know that, but understand that standing at the front of the store is just a small part." "I know what you do," I shouted. "You smile and nod at people, that's it." I was screaming myself hoarse. All the resentment was pouring out. As I escalated, so did my father. "No," he hollered back. "You cannot comprehend the feeling of freedom that is both primal and ancient. If you just stick to the plan, touch the rock of dreams, you will experience a life that few before you have ever contemplated." "Rock of dreams? What does that even mean? I demanded. He looked me right in the eyes, pursed his lips, and said, I've already said too much. When you were younger, it was so much easier. Remember, we'd play dinosaurs and you believed everything I said. I need you to remember what that was like. I need you to trust me. I'd heard that a million times. I stormed away and slammed my bedroom door behind me. The bullying followed me into high school. Now I was Wally Walmart to an even larger, more intimidating group of teenagers. And Colin was always there, like a tumor. Colin was an innovative bully. He managed to turn Wally Walmart into a song that all my classmates somehow managed to memorize. Even my math teacher accidentally referred to me once as Wally. My mind went in directions so morbid that I surprised myself. Sitting in class, I daydreamed about all the unspeakably horrible things that I wanted to do to Colin. In biology, I remembered giving Colin a case of Ebola and watching as he bled out from every orifice. In math class, I fantasized stabbing him in the eye with the pointy end of a compass, then slitting his throat with a sharpened protractor. In gym class, I envisioned Colin being pummeled with dodgeballs, pleading for mercy, as all my tormentors turned on him. My favorite murder fantasy, one that I kept revisiting, involved me turning into a velociraptor and ripping Colin into tattered, bloody shreds. Imagining his agonized screams brought me a degree of peace that was wholly lacking in my life. I was in the middle of a fantastic death scenario when Colin brought me tumbling back to reality. Hey, Shitstain, he said. I saw your dad at Walmart again. He waved at me and I popped in the bird. What do you think about that? I tried to ignore him. I hated Colin so much, but I hated my father more for providing Colin with all his degrading ammunition. I was on the cusp of finishing high school when my father passed away. In the weeks prior to his death, I was so overcome with resentment that we barely spoke. Despite sharing a house with him, I would avoid eye contact and pretend he was a piece of furniture. And on the few occasions we did speak, he would do his best to insinuate into the conversation my future as a Walmart greeter. Invariably, this would piss me off, and I would return to mentally erasing him from my reality. Then came the heart attack, and the time we had left together was counted in days. When I came to the hospital to visit him, I knew that it might be the last time we would ever speak. I was afraid he was going to bring up the job again, and that I would overreact. I did not want our last words together to be an argument. I trembled as I entered his hospital room. I saw that he was awake, and he tried sitting up, but the effort was too great. He settled back down heavily. I came closer and sat down beside him. He wheezed as he struggled to speak. I'm sorry, son. I know your life hasn't been easy, and I know a lot of that blame falls on my shoulders. He started coughing, and his whole body convulsed. He continued, I have held back on telling you the secrets of my job. I know you feel like I have been deceiving you, that for your whole life I have been defending a dead-end garbage job. I felt my blood rush, and I pursed my lips. He saw that I was becoming furious, and with the last bit of his energy, he raised his hand. I understand your rage, your fury. I just want you to know that, despite withholding information, I have never deceived you. The job is truly the key to unlocking your dreams. That was too much. I couldn't stand it anymore. Even now on his deathbed, he continued to reiterate the same crap. Without another word, I stormed out of the room. That was the last time I spoke with him. Later that day, he was struck by a second heart attack, the one that ended his life. Now without my father, I was alone. When I turned 18 a few months later, I felt lost. I had long taken for granted all the wonderful things my father did for me. He bought and prepared all our meals and provided a roof over my head. Most of all, he loved me, and despite my adolescent belligerence, I loved him too. I missed him dearly, and I regretted being such an unrepentant dickhead. With my father gone, I was on my own without a life preserver. It was time to enter the workforce, but all I had was my high school diploma. There aren't a lot of options out there for people without a degree. Even dishwashing and landscaping required references and 2 years minimum experience. I handed out my resume to dozens of businesses without a single callback. After my father's death, I had time to reflect on his life, and soon I developed a degree of empathy that was absent while he was alive. I realized in hindsight how rough his life truly was. He was a single parent raising a kid with a minimum wage job. He was trapped in a less than ideal career that he kept for my sake, to keep me fed with a roof over my head, and I was less than ungrateful. I shunned him for his sacrifice. It wasn't his fault I was teased in school. It was Colin's. Maybe I should have stood up to the bullies instead of passively enduring their blows. I was a coward and always ready to blame my father for my failings. I was pondering my situation when I got a phone call. "Hey, is this Murray's kid? Want a job?" It was one of my dad's coworkers. I recognized his voice as the bearded man from the funeral. I'd spent much of my life digging in my heels and actively rejecting the idea, and yet I was desperate. I needed a job or soon I would be homeless. A part of me thought that maybe if I took this job, I could make amends to my father for the way I treated him. So I put aside years of pent-up loathing to become a Walmart greeter. On my first day, they gave me a name tag and a used uniform that smelled like new sweat and old milk. I was brought into a claustrophobic office and was forced to watch a dull training video. I felt like the narrator was talking down to me. Be polite to the customers, always smile, and try to make a non-hostile amount of eye contact. My new supervisor brought me to the staff room. He said he was giving me my father's old locker. I saw the name, Mari, still taped next to an old combination lock. Inside it was empty except for a jet black plastic Tyrannosaurus Rex. I didn't cry, but I wanted to. Then I was ushered towards the front automatic doors to finally commence my career as a Walmart greeter. And you know what? It was exactly how I thought it would be. I smiled and nodded at hundreds of disinterested people. There were no surprises. This is it, I wondered to myself. It was easy money, albeit extremely boring. Initially, I thought it wasn't so bad, but then Colin came in. "Hey, look who it is. It's frickin' Wally Walmart. Like father, like son. Man, you're as pathetic as your old man." I have never been so instantly furious in my entire life. I wanted to strike him down with a volley of blows and stab him in the face with a dull steak knife. Instead, I did what the training video said. I smiled and nodded. He laughed and said, "Hang in there, numbnuts. You got a lifetime of smiling and nodding ahead of you." Huh. Oh man, this is fantastic. I was worried that after graduation I'd never see you again. Now I can visit you every day. I'll tell everyone that Wally Walmart has a job at Walmart. He grabbed a handcart, and I heard him cackling as he disappeared into the bowels of the store. By the end of the day, I was a wreck. All my suspicions were confirmed. The job sucked. There was nothing magical about it. My dreams were not coming true. Part of me still hoped that maybe my dad was right. Maybe there was some aspect to this job that was extraordinary. But then Colin's crap-eating grin intruded, and I felt nothing but shame. I was about to head home when one of the other greeters stopped me. "Hey, where are you going? You're going to miss the staff meeting." It was the bearded man. "Why, okay, yeah, sure," I said. I was seriously contemplating not showing up the next day, but I was too fatigued to offer any resistance when he gave me a nudge outside. In the parking lot, we found a lineup of a dozen people in Walmart vests climbing onto an old-school bus. The bearded man hollered, "Hey, everyone, this is Mari's kid." Everyone's eyes lit up. One of the greeters said, "You're in for a hell of a night, son." And another said, "We sure miss your father, but don't worry, you'll see him again soon." I didn't know what that meant. I was confused and tired and offered no resistance to being ushered onto the bus. As the bus drove us further out of town, my curiosity began to grow. I wondered where we were going and why everyone was so excited. Moreover, why wasn't the staff meeting back at Walmart in the clearly marked staff room? Soon the bus turned onto a winding dirt road and skirted around a dense forest. I asked the person sitting beside me, "What are we doing here?" They laughed and said, "We are going to make our dreams come true." I didn't push further. I felt nervousness flutter inside my chest. Soon we neared a large gate that swung open, allowed the bus to enter. We traveled through a dense corridor of foliage. Finally, the bus stopped and everyone poured out. I hesitantly stepped out of the bus and scanned my surroundings. I was surprised to find that we were in the middle of an open meadow with no buildings to be seen, just an impenetrable wall of trees. About 100 feet away from the bus, at the centermost point of the meadow, was a minivan-sized hunk of volcanic rock. Everyone walked towards it, and not wanting to be left behind, I followed. As I drew closer, the stone seemed to emit ever so slightly a dull neon green glow. The distinct smell of ozone filled the air. The bearded man saw my confusion and broke off from the group. "What are we doing here?" I asked. He gave me a hearty pat on the back and said, "Your dad would be so proud to see you here. Watch this." He pointed towards an older gentleman, who I recognized as one of the other greeters. His eyes were tightly closed, and he wore a huge grin on his face as he approached the rock. Suddenly, I heard a loud snap, and the old man stumbled backwards. He stood back up and brushed himself off. He opened his eyes and shouted, "Supper time!" The bearded man tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Look behind you." I turned around and I felt my grip on reality unhinge for a moment. Where before there was nothing but grass was a spectacular dining room table, decked out with the finest spread of food I have ever seen. There were half a dozen sumptuous multi-tiered cakes, and a steaming plate of a duck à l'orange, and enough lobster to feed a platoon. "How the hell did that happen?" I gasped. Once again, the bearded man pointed at another coworker. This time it was a woman. She wore the same overjoyed look on her face, with her eyes squeezed shut. The same procedure repeated. When she touched the rock, there was a loud snap and she fell backwards. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, an older gentleman appeared. I didn't recognize him as a coworker, and he was not with the original group. When she saw him, her eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. "Oh, Stanley, it is so good to see you." They rushed towards each other and held each other in a long embrace. Then, from an unseen speaker, music began to play. The pair immediately took this as a cue to start ballroom dancing. The bearded man turned to me and said, "Your turn." "My turn," I stammered. "What do I do?" "Just close your eyes and approach the rock," the bearded man said, "and your dreams will come true." My mind did not want to process what was occurring around me. The logical part of my brain kept shouting that this was all some elaborate ruse, or maybe some misguided hazing ritual enacted to put the new guy in his place. But then the irrational part reminded me that my father repeated over and over again that the job would make my dreams come true. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked up to the rock and cautiously reached out my hand. I felt all the hairs on the back of my arms suddenly go erect, and a disorienting feeling of vertigo washed over me. The smell of ozone became overwhelming, almost choking. When my fingertips finally made contact with the rock, I felt a sudden static shock, and I stumbled backwards. "What happened?" I tried to say, but my mouth couldn't properly form the words. Instead, I delivered a strange, bestial honk. My entire body felt wrong, like all the proportions I'd grown used to had once shifted out of place. The bearded man grinned at me and said, "Turn around." I obeyed, and behind me was a large mirror. I looked at my reflection and gasped. I transformed into a velociraptor. I had to be at least 2 meters long from snout to tail and 2 meters tall. I held up my hands and found that my fingers had been replaced by terrifying 3-inch long claws. I did not resemble the tiny, real-life feathered velociraptors known to paleontology. Instead, I was the artificial beast that existed solely in the movie Jurassic Park. "What the hell is happening to me?" I shouted. Surrounding me was a ring of Walmart greeters, all beaming with joy. I panicked. I needed to get out of there now. I broke away from the crowd and took off down the same road the bus came in on. Beside me, the trees rushed by in a dark green blur. I couldn't believe the speed as I rushed towards the front gate. My path was blocked and there was no way around, so I backpedaled, increased my speed, and jumped right over the gate. Once more, I was back on the road. I didn't know where else to go but back home, so I headed in that direction. Even though it was getting darker, I was confident I knew the way. Now on the open road, I sprinted as fast as a car. I was terrified, and I felt my heart machine gun in my chest. However, the more I ran, the more amazing I felt. This experience was really something else, something extraordinary, something I could only dream about. Then, like a flashbang, a message thrust itself into my brain. "Feed me." I stopped and skidded to a halt. What the hell was that? I wondered. I began running forward when once again the intrusive thought struck me like a seizure. "Feed me." I continued running, but now I no longer felt the urge to go home. Instead, overwhelmingly, some internal drive compelled me to make a detour to Colin's house. Soon I was in the alley that ran adjacent to Colin's home. I hid myself in a row of hedges and peered into his backyard. I heard barking and found him playing with his dog. I stuck my long, scaly snout out of the bushes. Suddenly, the dog looked in my direction and froze. An angry snarl followed. Colin bent over to pat his dog. "What is it, bud?" Slowly, the remainder of my massive bulk emerged from the bushes. "What the hell?" Colin shouted as he jumped into the air, falling hard on his ass. I inched closer and closer to his prone and panicked form. I was going to enjoy this. I raised my weaponized claws and saw terror blanket Colin's face. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in my life. Then I tore him to shreds as his dog barked helplessly. I realized I was covered head to claw in Colin's blood. Bringing all this gore home would be a terrible idea, so I ran back to the woods. I found the gate and once more leapt over it and made my way towards the rock. For years I dreamed of all the horrible things I would do to Colin. I should have felt ashamed of what I had done, but I didn't. The intrusive message of "feed me" was gone. And now I felt an overwhelming sensation of pleasure and satiety. As I approached the rock, I was greeted by a round of applause. "You did it!" the bearded man shouted. "The rock is satisfied and will not need to feed for a few more years." He patted me on my long lizard back. "You've got a promising career as a Walmart greeter." Previously, that thought would have sent me into an apoplectic rage, but now everything was different. Now I felt pride. The bearded man had one more thing to say. "There was someone here to see you." I looked behind him and saw towering over us a life-sized, jet-black Tyrannosaurus Rex wearing a gigantic blue Walmart vest. "Dad, is that you?" Pancreatic cancer. That's what it's called. The thing that's slowly killing my wife. It doesn't sound so horrifying, does it? Pancreatic. It's the cancer part that's bad, obviously. It's the cancer part that's slowly eating away at my wife. My one true love. Relentlessly devouring every part of her, until there's just a withering, wheezing stranger left. Her tormented gaze begging for it to be over. Every fiber of her being aching for death. I'd tried everything up to that point, and I mean everything. You'd be amazed and appalled at the sheer quantity of bullshit snake oil miracle remedy crap you'll find if you just go looking for them. All the healers, shamans, witch doctors, and loathsome charlatans preying on the weak and desperate. But conventional medicine had failed me, failed my wife, and I couldn't find it in me to give up, no matter how much she begged me to. At first glance, the nameless street seemed like just another hoax, a nonsensical ritual pasta designed to amass internet points. But the more I looked into it, the more I came to believe that there had to be some merits to it. Too many identical claims, too many similar experiences, too many vivid descriptions. Coming up empty on all other leads, I decided there'd be no harm in giving it a shot. The nameless street was as simple in its complexity as it was complex in its simplicity. At the end of an unnamed street, look for an abandoned house with a locked basement door. Find a way to get into the basement without breaking the lock. In the room beyond, you'll find 2 chairs facing each other. Make sure to lock the door again. Place 66 candles in a wide circle around the room. At the center, place 1/6 of a candle. When night is at its darkest, light all the candles. Sit down in the chair with the back turned to the door and count loudly to 66 and 1/6. If you get it all right, the devil himself will appear, granting you a single wish in exchange for your soul. Finding the nameless street wasn't easy, but at the same time it wasn't that hard either. I just stumbled upon it, I guess. I went searching every morning after my visit at the hospital. That's the only thing that kept me going. Seeing her wasting away, another fragment of her dying every day. Body, mind, soul. Soon there'd be nothing left but memories. I paced the streets tirelessly for weeks, making sure to cover as much ground as I possibly could. Then one night, it was just there. The doctors gave her a month, maybe less. We'd been together since high school, 10 years. Got married as soon as we legally could, sharing dreams of children, a house, a dog, a station wagon, a normal, boring, wonderful life. We were going to grow old together, die together, locked in an unbreakable embrace, exhaling our last breath at the exact same moment. But now she was leaving, fading, and I felt helpless and lost and alone. I needed this. I needed it to be real. It was just like I imagined. A harrowing house at the end of the street, all the windows smashed in, front door missing, exterior graying and faded. A faint smell of urine lingered inside, and the walls were all covered in tasteless graffiti. I didn't care to inspect the house itself. I was there for one thing. I descended the ramshackle stairs leading down to a surprisingly sturdy-looking wooden door and gave the handle a try. Locked. This was the place. When I wasn't at the hospital, Stan was. I didn't even have to convince him. I just wanted someone to be there by her side at all times, and I think he understood that. My brother got along well with my wife, and it seemed like the right thing to do. When I arrived after work, Stan would be there, and we'd talk for a bit. It affected him too, devoured him like it devoured me. He looked older than any younger brother should. I had to fix this, or we'd all just fade to nothingness. I returned the next evening with candles and tools. I had no idea how to pick a lock, but luckily some guy on YouTube did, and after about 30 minutes of finagling and cursing, I heard a soft click, followed by the door sliding open. The basement was just how I'd imagined it too, cramped and damp and dark. 2 chairs placed at the exact center of it. Once I'd made sure the door was locked, I started placing the candles in a wide circle, saving the 1/6 of a candle for last. I sat down on the chair with the back turned to the door and waited. When the night is at its darkest, how can you tell? Isn't night just a lack of light? When the sun is down, isn't it just down? I felt stupid, ignorant, like I'd fooled myself into believing something that'd never work. How could it work? It was utterly ridiculous. But still, I couldn't give up now. I had to try. I owed my wife that much. I started lighting the candles. I figured it wouldn't get any darker, and couldn't very well spend all night in that creepy abandoned crap hole. Better to just get it over with. It took a good 5 minutes to get all the candles in the circle lit, and I swallowed deeply before lighting the final one. It didn't feel any different. but I sat down regardless and started counting loudly to 66 and a sixth seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. My voice rang hollow and insincere. I glanced around anxiously while counting, but save for the dancing shadows cast by the flickering candles, there was nothing. 33, 34, 35. Don't you find this hysterically ridiculous? A cheery voice queried from behind me. I suppose I wasn't really expecting anything to happen. Not really. Thus, the sudden realization that someone was there, behind me, caused me to tumble off the chair in shock, and I spent quite some time desperately struggling to get back up. I mean, you must have stopped at 66 and a sixth and gone, wow, this is some next level absurd as hell nonsense, right? He was not what I expected, at all. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, long blonde hair, dressed in jeans and a white hoodie. He smiled widely, emerald eyes sparkling vividly as they scanned the room. All you had to do was ask, he mimicked, holding up a phone to his ear. No need for this unnecessarily elaborate. He paused, waggling his right index finger around theatrically. I want to say... ritual? Who are you? I stammered incoherently. Such a useless question. He chuckled. Names have no meaning here. Are you? I staggered back into the wall. Are you the devil? Look, buddy. He grinned widely. It really isn't that important. What is important, however, is what I can do for you. He wandered around the room nonchalantly, eyes darting back and forth between the flickering candles and me. He was tall and slim, yet unnaturally imposing, like he could squish me like a bug at any moment, if he felt like it. I kept backing into the wall senselessly, like a frightened animal. Let's sit, shall we? He beckoned for me to join him as he sat down. We have so much to discuss. Oh my God, I mumbled. Was this really happening? Nothing about it felt right. It felt unholy, blasphemous. My back scraped against the cold, protruding bricks of the wall, like the pain somehow grounded me to reality. Oh my freaking goodness, I added. Look, you can call me anything you'd like if it makes you feel better. His piercing eyes dug into mine. It really doesn't matter what fantasy you subscribe to. In the end, they're all nothing but lies, and just like names, they only hold meaning to owners and believers. And let's just say I'm neither. Now, please, just sit, James. You're making this whole satanic deal thingy very awkward for the both of us. How do you know my name? I mumbled, still subconsciously backing into the unmoving wall. He threw his head back and laughed heartily. So you came here, ready to summon the literal devil, but you're surprised he somehow knows your name? James. You're really out of your depth here, you know that, right? He motioned towards the vacant chair. Sit, James, sit, and we'll discuss what I can do for Nora. The mention of her name brought me back from whatever delirious state I was in. I suppose I immediately stopped caring whether it was real or not. The end justifies the means, isn't that what they say? Even if I was hallucinating, even if this was some insanely convoluted hoax. I had to give it a shot. I'd never forgive myself if I didn't at least try. I hesitantly stumbled to the chair and sat down facing the man. How do you know her name? I asked. How can you possibly know any of this? We've been through this, James. I know all I need to know, and that's just how it is. For instance, I know that Nora, sweet, darling Nora, is slowly dying from cancer. I say slowly, but that's really not the case anymore, is it? I'd give her maybe a few days, a week at most. Better start making some arrangements. Choose a nice coffin, find a decent plot, organize the service. These things take time, you know. Wouldn't want to half-ass her funeral now, would you? I felt a sudden rush of anger and resentment and sadness and despair. I wanted nothing more than to just punch his infuriatingly carefree face in, but something deep down inside told me that would be a horrible idea. Instead, I just broke down crying, heavy, convulsive sobs. There, there, James, my boy. It isn't over yet, he smiled. What if I told you I could take it all out of her? The cancer. Just reach into that frail, broken body and rummage around in there until it's all gone. Wouldn't that be amazing? I stared at him blankly, tears running down my face. Could you do that? I murmured. Could you really do that? I could. He leaned back, hands behind his head. But I'd have to put it somewhere else. Natural order, balance, all that jazz. But I'll do you a solid, since I kind of like you, James. What do you mean? See, what I do with it, the cancer, is entirely up to me. I mean, I could just stuff it in you, and normally I would, I'm a stickler for irony. You know how it goes. You can't live without the love of your life, so you make an unholy deal with some diabolical entity to save her, only to die days later. Hilarious. But since you've grown on me like a tumor, I'll do you one better. What do you say we stick the big C into your worst enemy instead? My worst enemy? Did I even have enemies? I mean, I didn't really like my boss, and my neighbor was incredibly annoying. And truth be told, I could really do without the "you're not good enough for my daughter" attitude from my mother-in-law, too. But an enemy? I suppose my coworker Eric was the closest thing I had to an enemy. He was demeaning and malicious, always going out of his way to make me look bad. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much I hated him. Yes, I said. Do it. There's this guy, Eric, at my job. Oh, I'm sorry, he interrupted. I think you misunderstood me. I don't need to know who you think your worst enemy is. No, James, my guy. I know who your worst enemy is. I just need a yes and the old handshake to confirm our arrangement. That's all. How do I know you can do it? I suddenly felt a sobering doubt rising. This was all too good to be true. Too crazy to be real. How do I know I can trust you? Oh, I'm glad you asked, he chuckled. It's smart, to question these things. I'm sure I manifested in this locked basement out of thin air and know more about you and your wife than any random stranger possibly could, but I get it. You need proof. He stood up from the chair and leaned in close to me. I instinctively sat into my seat, desperately trying to avoid his piercing gaze. Now, I would love to say that this wasn't going to hurt. His eyes gleamed eerily in the darkness. But I'd be lying. And truth is everything, isn't it? That's why you're here, for the truth. You might not know it yet, granted, but you will. And who knows, you might even come to thank me one day. What are you With inhuman speed, he stuck both his hands into my chest. I know it's impossible. Of course I know it's impossible. But the pain was real, and the blood was too. Insufferable pain, like every nerve ending in my body was set on fire. Fountains of blood showered us both, and I felt the sudden presence of an impenetrable darkness. Don't cross over just yet, Jamesy boy, he laughed. We're only just getting started. I could feel him touching me from the inside, fingers digging into tissue and muscle and organs, every little prod bringing insurmountable waves of torment, somehow spreading to every pain receptor at once. I couldn't breathe, so I couldn't scream. But I imagine every synapse in my body lighting up simultaneously to form a hysterical howl. Ah, he licked his lips. There we go. Just the suckers we were looking for. They can be a handful, let me tell you. And all this blood makes it hard, too, Takes practice. With a forceful yank, he pulled his hands back, leaving behind a gaping hole in my chest. I should be dead, I thought as I stared into the mangled depths of my own body. I was convulsing uncontrollably in spasming seizures, but I still managed to get a long, good look at what he was proudly holding in his blood-dripping hands. Recognize them? He laughed. They're called lungs. Primarily used for breathing, I've been told. Ugly suckers, though, don't you think? Most of the stuff you find on the inside doesn't look as good as the outside. I guess there's some meaning to it, aesthetics and such. He waved them around playfully, blood squirting everywhere. Every muscle in my body was spasming violently now. and I felt my mind starting to slip, overwhelmed by the unimaginable pain. I'm going to die, I thought. This is it. This is where they'll find me. But just as the alluring darkness was about to overcome me, I was brought back by his cheery voice. "So, does that do it?" he asked, his mouth now inches from my ear. "Are you convinced? Do we have an agreement?" I tried my best to nod, but I'm not sure you could easily discern the voluntary movements from the involuntary anymore. Blood was flowing in thick streams from the gaping wound on my chest, pouring into an impossibly deep pond on the cold concrete below. Suddenly he grabbed my hand and shook it vigorously. "Good lad." He laughed heartily. "It's a deal then. I'll yank the nasty tumors from sweet darling Nora and pack your worst enemy full of that stuff. Really can't wait for this one, James. Sounds like an absolute riot." "Really can't wait for this one, James. Sounds like an absolute riot." The darkness was closing in, and I felt some manner of peace as a thick blanket of heavy tiredness enveloped every part of my being. "I'll be on my merry way then," he said. "People to meet and eat. You know how it goes." I could hear him walking towards the door, heavy steps echoing through the room. Too heavy for his lithe frame. Everything was turning black now, and I suppose I was mere seconds away from passing out, and when his voice brought me back once more. "Oh, right. I forgot." He chuckled. "You probably need these." My numbing pain shot through my body as he pushed his hands into the wound again, brutally rummaging around in there for what felt like ages. Then, with a sudden yank, he was out again. "There you go," he said. "Good as new. Keep those suckers clean now, you hear? Stay away from cigarettes and huffing asbestos." He laughed. "Anyway, I'll be seeing you, James. I have a feeling we'll talk again real soon." And with that, he was gone. I was left slumped over in my chair, wheezing and spasming for minutes, before realizing I was completely fine. I refused to believe it at first. I examined my chest thoroughly, every inch of it, then turned my attention to the floor. Not a drop of blood, not so much as a paper cut on my chest. It was like it had never happened. But it did, didn't it? The pain was so real, so horribly, gruesomely real. Minutes of excruciating torture that felt like years, and then nothing? I didn't stick around to question what had happened. I got out of that basement in a panicky haze and never looked back. When I got home, I immediately collapsed on the couch and slept for 12 hours straight. I'm sure I would have slept longer, probably days, maybe a week, but I was ripped from my deep slumber by the sound of my phone. "Yeah," I mumbled. "Who's this?" "James," Stan yelled excitedly. "You're not going to believe this. It's a damn miracle." A miracle. Even the doctors agreed. There was just no medical explanation for Nora's sudden recovery. No rational way to describe how the cancer had just vanished. Poof. Not a trace left in her. A miracle, they all agreed. Deep down, I knew that wasn't the case, of course. It wasn't miraculous at all. In fact, it was probably the exact opposite. But I didn't care. I was just so happy she was still here, still alive, still breathing. I've never cried like I cried that day. Tears of joy. Who knew such a thing could be real? Weeks went by, and that night in the basement slowly faded from memory. I guess I just went with it, Pretended it was all some vivid hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and desperation and grief. And when Eric didn't get horribly sick and die, like I'd secretly hoped, I just let it all go. Life moved on. Except it didn't. It all stopped in that basement. Maybe not stopped, but perverted. Grew out of control like cancerous cells. My wife sat down with me a month later. "We need to talk," she said. I could tell by the look on her face that it wasn't anything good. There were tears, lots of them, crocodile and otherwise, and a pained, guilt-ridden expression. She wanted a divorce, she told me. She'd been seeing another man for quite some time now, but because of the cancer and her imminent death, she didn't have it in her heart to tell me. But now that she was healthy and had her life back, she wanted to move on, wanted to find happiness again. "Who?" I remember yelling. "Who the hell is he?" "It's your brother," she sniffled pathetically. "It's Stan." I suppose my life ended there. Betrayal comes in all shapes and sizes, but from my own brother, my own flesh and blood. It was too much to bear, and I guess I felt it already then. The hate, that seething anger and fury and resentment, consuming every fragment of my existence from there on out. She moved out the same day, packed her crap and went to live with my brother. I sat in the darkness of my trashed living room for days, fueled and fed by nothing but babbling detestation and loathing and hatred. I wanted to burn him alive, nail him to the wall, dig out his eyes with a rusty knife. He was already dead to me, but I wanted him dead to the world too. My worst enemy. And then, like clockwork, he got diagnosed with cancer. Pancreatic. Such a beautiful word. Rolls right off the tip of your tongue. Pancreatic. Instant and terminal. My brother died days after they first caught it. It spread faster than anything they'd ever seen, they told me. A reverse miracle of sorts. I cried no tears at the funeral. I don't think I'll ever cry again. Nora couldn't deal with his death. Her sudden recovery followed by the hope of a new life with a new love, smothered instantly by cruel, hideous irony. She hung herself in Stan's garage a week later. I tried to cry at her funeral, I really did, but it was all empty, hollow and void, a soulless husk. There was this moment, after they lowered her coffin, a brief second of serene silence. No birds, no grieving masses, no wind, just a perfect moment of tranquility. I could hear him clearly then, in the back of my mind, a cheery chuckle, a hearty laugh. I have a feeling we'll talk again real soon. Just like the uncontrollable growth of abnormal cells, the amassing sum of my sins spread to cover every aspect of my existence. There is no miracle, reverse or otherwise, waiting for me at the end of the line. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is no end to the tunnel. There is no end. As I stare into the fathomless depths of my empty void soul, I can only nod and agree. Real soon.